Michel Foucault had 3 months to live when he finished his final books. He knew he was dying, AIDS was destroying his body, but he kept writing, racing against time, trying to complete one last idea, that you could turn your life into an experiment, a work of art, something no one had tried before. This was June 1984. The books came out. 3 weeks later, he was dead at 57. French newspapers struggled with how to describe him. The most important philosopher since Sartre, a dangerous radical, a prophet of the postmodern age. The truth is stranger. Foucault spent 30 years proving that everything you think is natural was actually invented yesterday. And if it was invented, it can be changed. Mental illness, invented in the 1600s as a way to lock up anyone who did not fit in. Prisons, designed to create criminals, not reform them. Sexuality, a modern obsession that did not exist before the 1800s. Your sense of self, constructed by power, not discovered within you. Even humanity itself, a recent concept that might soon disappear. These ideas made people furious. Psychiatrists were outraged. Prison reformers accused him of nihilism. Feminists had complicated relationships with his work. Marxists said he ignored economics. Conservatives hated everything he stood for. No political movement could fully claim him. But here is why Foucault matters now, 40 years after his death. We live in the world he predicted. Constant surveillance through our phones, algorithms predicting our behavior, social media demanding endless confession, prisons expanding despite obviously failing, therapy culture making us endlessly examine ourselves, experts claiming authority over every aspect of life. We are simultaneously more free and more controlled than any society in history. Foucault gave us the tools to understand this paradox. He showed that modern power does not work by saying no. It works by getting inside your head so completely that you control yourself. The most effective prison is the one you cannot see. The most total control is the kind you participate in willingly. But he also showed that resistance is possible, not through revolution that overthrows everything at once, but through constant experimentation, refusal, and self-creation, through making your life into something power did not plan for. Paul-Michel Foucault was born on October 15, 1926, in Poitiers, a provincial city in western France. His father was a successful surgeon who expected his son to follow the same path. The family was prosperous, conservative, and conventional. Foucault would spend his life rebelling against everything they represented. Childhood was difficult. He was a brilliant but troubled student, prone to depression and fits of rage. At the elite Lycée Henri IV in Paris, where he prepared for university entrance exams, classmates remembered him as isolated and intense. He attempted suicide at least once during these years. The reasons remain unclear, but biographers point to his emerging awareness of his homosexuality in a deeply Catholic and homophobic society. In 1946, Foucault entered the École Normale Supérieure, the most prestigious institution for training French intellectuals. Here he encountered the dominant philosophical currents of post-war France, phenomenology, existentialism, and Marxism. He studied under Jean Hippolyte, a leading interpreter of Hegel, and attended lectures by Maurice Merleau-Ponty. For a brief period, he joined the Communist Party, following many intellectuals of his generation who saw Marxism as the only response to fascism and colonialism. But Foucault's relationship with the party was troubled from the start. He found the rigid orthodoxy suffocating. In 1951, he quit, later calling his membership a mistake born of conformism rather than conviction. This break would shape his later work. He would spend decades analyzing how institutions, even those promising liberation, exercise control over individuals. The early 1950s were marked by severe psychological crisis. Foucault suffered from depression so intense that friends feared for his life. He was hospitalized briefly. The experience of psychiatric treatment, of being observed and categorized by doctors, would later fuel his first major work on madness. He began visiting psychiatric hospitals, not as a patient now, but as an observer, watching how institutions processed and transformed those labeled mentally ill. In 1951, Foucault passed the aggregation, the competitive exam for teaching posts, but instead of taking a conventional academic position, he made a series of unconventional choices. He left France for Sweden, taking a post teaching French at the University of Uppsala. Over the next decade, he would live in Sweden, Poland, and Germany, working in cultural diplomacy and teaching positions that kept him far from the Parisian intellectual scene. This exile was partly strategic. France in the 1950s was dominated by Jean-Paul Sartre and existentialism. Foucault wanted to develop his own voice away from this overwhelming influence. It was also personal. Life as an openly gay man was easier in Scandinavia than in France. In Uppsala, he could live with lovers without constant fear of exposure or arrest. During these years abroad, Foucault wrote his first book. Madness and Civilization appeared in 1961 when he was 34. It was a historical study of how European society had treated madness from the Renaissance through the 19th century. But it was also a philosophical bomb. Foucault argued that what we call mental illness is not a timeless medical reality, but a historical construct, a way societies exclude and control those who disturb the social order. The book made him famous in France, but not yet internationally. He returned to France and took a teaching position in philosophy. Then came The Birth of the Clinic in 1963 and The Order of Things in 1966. This last book became an unlikely bestseller. French newspapers declared that structuralism was the new intellectual fashion, and Foucault, despite his protests, was labeled one of its leaders alongside Claude Lévi-Strauss and Jacques Lacan. The May 1968 student uprisings in Paris politicized Foucault in a new way. He was teaching in Tunisia during the protests there in 1967 and 1968, and witnessed students being beaten and imprisoned for demanding democratic reforms. When he returned to France, he found a country transformed. Students had occupied universities, workers had gone on strike, and the government had nearly fallen. The revolution failed, but it shattered the consensus about how French society should work. Foucault threw himself into activism. He co-founded the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, an organization that gave prisoners a platform to describe conditions in their own words. He participated in demonstrations, was arrested, and used his growing celebrity to draw attention to prison reform. This activist period directly shaped his next major work, Discipline and Punish, published in 1975. In 1970, Foucault was elected to the Collège de France, the highest honor in French academic life. His chair was titled History of Systems of Thought. The position gave him enormous freedom. No students to grade, no committees to serve on, only an obligation to deliver public lectures each year. He would hold this position until his death. The 1970s saw Foucault at the height of his influence. He traveled constantly, lecturing in the United States, Brazil, Japan, and across Europe. He became involved in international human rights campaigns, protesting Soviet treatment of dissidents, speaking out for Vietnamese boat people, and supporting the Solidarity movement in Poland. Critics on the left attacked him for this, claiming he had abandoned Marxism for liberal humanism. Foucault responded that his opposition to all forms of domination was consistent, whether exercised by capitalist or socialist states. In 1976, he published the first volume of The History of Sexuality. He announced it as the beginning of a 6-volume project. But then, something strange happened. He published nothing more for 8 years. He later explained that the project had run into problems, that he needed to rethink his entire approach. During this silence, he was traveling to California, experiencing the gay liberation movement in San Francisco, and researching ancient Greek and Roman ethics. When he finally published volumes 2 and 3 of The History of Sexuality in 1984, they were completely different from what he had announced. Instead of analyzing modern sexuality, they explored how ancient Greeks and Romans understood ethics, self-control, and the care of the self. Readers and critics were puzzled. Some thought he had abandoned his earlier work. Others saw a continuity. He was still analyzing how human beings are made into subjects, but now through practices of self-transformation rather than external domination. Foucault did not live to explain this turn fully. In June 1984, he died of AIDS-related illness. He was 57. He had been ill for months but refused to publicly acknowledge his condition. The disease was still poorly understood, stigmatized, and associated primarily with gay men. Foucault's death was one of the first high-profile AIDS deaths in France, though newspapers at the time often obscured the cause. His funeral was attended by hundreds. The French intellectual establishment mourned him as one of the most important thinkers of the century. But his work was far from finished. The planned volumes of The History of Sexuality would never be written. Lecture courses he had given at the Collège de France remained unpublished for decades, only gradually appearing in the years after his death. Foucault left behind a body of work that would transform multiple disciplines: philosophy, history, sociology, literary criticism, gender studies, and critical theory. But he also left questions. What would he have written about AIDS, about the medicalization and political management of the epidemic? How would he have analyzed the rise of neoliberalism, which was just beginning during his lifetime? What would he have made of the internet, surveillance technologies, and the new forms of power emerging in the 21st century? These questions remain open. Foucault gave us tools to think with, not a finished system. His life, like his work, resisted easy categorization. He was a philosopher who wrote history, a radical who mistrusted revolutionary promises, a theorist of power who insisted that resistance is always possible. Understanding his philosophy requires understanding this restless, difficult, brilliant life. The Archaeologist and the Genealogist, Foucault's revolutionary method. Foucault did not approach philosophy as most of his predecessors had. He was not interested in constructing grand theories about truth, justice, or the good life. Instead, he developed two distinct methodological approaches that allowed him to analyze how knowledge and power function in concrete historical situations. He called these methods archaeology and genealogy. Archaeology came first. Foucault developed this approach in his books of the 1960s, particularly The Order of Things and The Archaeology of Knowledge. The term might seem strange. What does philosophy have to do with digging up ancient artifacts? But Foucault chose the metaphor deliberately. Just as archaeologists excavate layers of earth to uncover past civilizations, Foucault wanted to excavate layers of discourse to uncover past systems of thought. His aim was to study what he called epistemes, the fundamental codes and structures that determine what counts as knowledge in a given historical period. Every era, Foucault argued, has an underlying framework that governs how people think, what questions they can ask, and what answers are possible. This framework is usually invisible to those living within it. It seems natural, obvious, the only way to think. Only by comparing different historical periods can we see that our current ways of thinking are not universal, but contingent and historical. Consider how the Renaissance understood resemblance. Everything was organized by similarities, correspondences, and sympathies. Plants were used as medicines because they resembled the organs they could heal. The universe was an infinite web of likenesses. Then, in the 17th century, this entire episteme collapsed. The new classical age organized knowledge through representation, order, and taxonomy. The goal was to create clear tables that classified everything according to visible differences. This shift was not a simple progress from ignorance to truth. It was a fundamental transformation in how human beings made sense of the world. Archaeology studies these transformations without judging them. Foucault refused to write a triumphalist history where knowledge steadily improves. He refused to write a decline narrative where truth is progressively lost. Instead, he described discontinuities, moments when the entire field of knowledge reorganizes itself according to new rules. These reorganizations are not caused by great thinkers discovering the truth. They emerge from complex interactions among institutions, practices, and discourses that no single person controls. The archaeological method involves several steps. First, identify the statements actually made in a given period. Not the deep meaning or hidden message, but the surface level of what was literally said and written. Second, analyze the rules that governed which statements were possible and which were excluded. What could be said? What could not be said? What questions could be asked? Third, describe how these rules form a system, an episteme that gives coherence to apparently disparate fields of knowledge. This approach was radical because it bypassed the traditional concerns of intellectual history. Foucault did not ask whether past thinkers were right or wrong. He did not trace the influence of one philosopher on another. He ignored the intentions and beliefs of individual authors. Instead, he treated texts as events in a field governed by impersonal rules. Knowledge, in this view, is not produced by brilliant individuals making discoveries. It is produced by systems that enable certain kinds of statements to be made. But archaeology had limitations. It described structures of knowledge but could not explain how they arose or why they changed. It bracketed questions of power, treating knowledge as autonomous from social and political forces. By the early 1970s, Foucault recognized these limitations and developed a second method, genealogy. Genealogy was inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche, particularly his essay on the genealogy of morals. Nietzsche had argued that our moral values have a history, and that this history reveals their origins in power struggles rather than rational reflection. Foucault took this insight and applied it to a wide range of phenomena: punishment, sexuality, the human sciences, and the modern subject itself. Genealogy asks different questions than archaeology. Where did this practice come from? Not its official justification, but its actual historical emergence. What were the accidents, struggles, and contingencies that brought it into being? What power relations does it serve? How does it dominate, exclude, or normalize? Genealogy is a history of the present. It takes something that seems natural and necessary in our current world and shows that it was constructed, that it emerged from specific conflicts, and that it could be otherwise. The genealogical method has several key features. First, it focuses on the body. Power does not just operate through laws and ideologies. It operates on bodies directly, training them, disciplining them, making them useful and docile. Second, genealogy attends to the micro level of power. It studies techniques, procedures, and practices rather than grand institutions or theories. How are prisoners managed? How are students examined? How are patients observed? These small mechanisms reveal how power actually functions. Third, genealogy refuses to search for origins. Traditional history looks for the founding moment, the pure beginning, the essence that has been lost or corrupted. Genealogy shows instead that beginnings are always messy. What we think of as a unified phenomenon turns out to have multiple and often contradictory origins. The prison, for example, did not emerge from a single idea or intention. It emerged from the convergence of military discipline, monastic organization, industrial training, and educational techniques. Fourth, genealogy is explicitly political. It does not pretend to neutrality. By showing that current arrangements are historical constructions, genealogy opens space for resistance. If things were made, they can be unmade. If current practices emerge from struggles, they can be challenged by new struggles. Genealogy arms critical movements by denaturalizing what appears natural. The relationship between archaeology and genealogy has been debated. Some interpreters see them as two phases in Foucault's work, with genealogy replacing archaeology. Others see them as complementary methods that Foucault used simultaneously after the early 1970s. Foucault himself was not always clear or consistent on this point. What is clear is that both methods share certain assumptions. Both reject the idea that history is progressive. Both refuse to explain the present as the necessary outcome of the past. Both treat knowledge as inseparable from power, and both aim to disturb our certainties about who we are and what we take for granted. These methods had enormous influence. Historians adopted genealogical approaches to study topics ranging from sexuality to racism to citizenship. Sociologists used Foucauldian analysis to examine institutions like schools, hospitals, and corporations. Literary critics explored how discourses construct subjectivity. Legal scholars examined how law produces categories and identities. The result was a transformation in how humanistic and social scientific research is conducted. But the methods also drew criticism. Some argued that Foucault's rejection of truth and progress led to relativism. If all knowledge claims are products of power, how can we distinguish better from worse accounts? Others objected that his focus on discourse neglected material factors like economics. Still others found his writing style obscure and his historical claims insufficiently documented. Foucault responded to some of these criticisms. He insisted that showing knowledge is connected to power does not mean all knowledge claims are equally valid. Some claims are better supported by evidence, more coherent, more productive. But we should always ask who benefits from a particular way of organizing knowledge. He also acknowledged that economic and material factors matter, but argued that they do not determine everything. Power operates through discourses, practices, and institutions that have their own logic and effects. Perhaps the most important aspect of Foucault's method is its practical orientation. He was not interested in methodology for its own sake. Archaeology and genealogy were tools for diagnosing the present, for understanding how we have become what we are, and for imagining how we might become something different. Philosophy, for Foucault, was not an abstract discipline removed from life. It was a critical practice that could help us question our present and create new possibilities for existing. Philosophy as diagnosis, Nietzsche's Heir. To understand Foucault's conception of philosophy, one must begin with Friedrich Nietzsche. Foucault read Nietzsche intensively in the 1950s and later described this encounter as transformative. Nietzsche offered an alternative to the dominant philosophical traditions of phenomenology and existentialism that shaped French thought in the post-war period. More importantly, Nietzsche provided a model for how philosophy could critique the present without appealing to universal truths or foundations. Nietzsche had proclaimed the death of God and announced that all values must be revalued. He rejected the Platonic Christian worldview that had dominated Western thought for millennia. In place of this metaphysical tradition, Nietzsche offered a philosophy centered on life, power, and becoming. Truth was not correspondence to an eternal realm, but a tool that serves life. Morality was not given by God or reason, but emerged from historical power struggles. The philosopher's task was not to discover timeless truths, but to diagnose the present age and its values. Foucault took up this Nietzschean project in a specific way. He transformed philosophy into what he called a history of the present. This phrase captures his approach precisely. He wrote histories, but not for their own sake. He wrote about the past to illuminate present realities. Each book was an intervention into contemporary debates, an attempt to show that things we take as natural or inevitable have a history and therefore can be changed. Consider Discipline and Punish. The book appears to be a history of the prison from the 18th century onward, but Foucault was not simply interested in how punishment changed. He was diagnosing contemporary society. His real subject was how modern power operates through discipline, surveillance, and normalization. The prison was just the most visible example of techniques that had spread throughout society. Schools, hospitals, factories, barracks, all organized on similar principles. This diagnostic approach required a particular stance toward the present. Foucault refused to endorse the dominant narratives of progress and enlightenment. He did not believe that modern societies were more rational, more humane, or more free than their predecessors. He saw instead new forms of control, more subtle and pervasive than earlier forms. Where others saw liberation, he saw new techniques of domination. But Foucault was not a pessimist announcing that everything had gotten worse. His point was more complex. Modern societies had not replaced old oppressions with new freedom. They had replaced one form of power with another. Understanding this required abandoning the framework of liberation and oppression that dominated left politics. Power was not something that could be overthrown once and for all. It was a complex strategic situation, constantly producing resistance even as it sought to control. This Nietzschean inheritance shaped how Foucault understood the philosopher's role. The philosopher was not a scientist discovering truths about reality, nor was the philosopher a prophet revealing moral imperatives. The philosopher was a diagnostician, someone who could see patterns in the present that others missed. This required historical knowledge, certainly, but not the knowledge of professional historians who study the past for its own sake. It required what Nietzsche called genealogical investigation, tracing how present values, institutions, and practices emerged from past struggles. Genealogy was Nietzsche's method for revealing the contingency of what appears necessary. He had used it to show that Christian morality emerged not from divine revelation, but from the resentment of the weak against the strong. Foucault extended this method to modern phenomena. He showed that the human sciences emerged not from pure pursuit of knowledge, but from institutional practices of examination and normalization. He showed that modern sexuality emerged not from lifting Victorian repression, but from new techniques of confessing and regulating desire. The goal was not to prove that knowledge is always false or that morality is always hypocritical. The goal was to shake our confidence in the present, to show that things could be otherwise. Nietzsche had written that all great things bring about their own destruction through an act of self-overcoming. Foucault applied this to modernity itself. Modernity contained resources for critiquing and transforming itself. The task was to activate these resources. This meant rejecting what Foucault called blackmail. We are constantly presented with false alternatives. Either you support enlightenment and progress, or you are irrational and reactionary. Either you accept current institutions as basically sound, or you are a nihilist. Foucault refused these choices. He insisted on a more complex stance, using the tools of rational analysis to critique reason itself, defending certain values of the Enlightenment while rejecting others, maintaining that life under modern institutions is different rather than simply better than what came before. This stance was easily misunderstood. Critics accused Foucault of being against reason, against truth, against morality. But this was not his position. He was against the claim that reason, truth, and morality have a single universal form. He wanted to multiply rationalities, truths, and ethical possibilities. He wanted to show that the specific forms of reason and morality dominant in modern Western societies are not the only possible forms. Nietzsche had distinguished between two types of history. Monumental history celebrates great events and heroes of the past. Antiquarian history preserves traditions and venerates origins. Critical history, by contrast, puts the past on trial. It shows that what we have inherited is not sacred, but problematic. Foucault practiced critical history in this Nietzschean sense. He brought the past before the tribunal of the present, not to condemn it, but to question what it has made of us. This philosophical practice had implications for political action. Foucault was suspicious of grand revolutionary narratives that promised total transformation. He had seen how such promises led to new forms of domination. The Soviet Union had abolished capitalist exploitation, but created new systems of control. Third world liberation movements had overthrown colonizers, but often installed authoritarian regimes. The lesson was not that revolutionary change is impossible, but that it requires constant vigilance and critique. Foucault called this stance hyperactivism combined with pessimism. Be active in resisting specific forms of domination, but do not expect that resistance will ever be complete or final. Do not wait for the revolution that will solve all problems. Work on transforming present realities, knowing that any transformation will create new problems requiring new struggles. This was a Nietzschean ethic of permanent critique rather than a utopian promise of final liberation. Philosophy as diagnosis required specific practices. One must master historical methods to trace how the present emerged. One must analyze discourses to reveal their rules and exclusions. One must study institutions to understand how they shape behavior. One must attend to the micro-mechanisms through which power operates, and one must remain alert to possibilities for resistance and transformation that emerge within existing systems. But diagnosis also required a certain ethos. The philosopher must maintain critical distance from dominant values and assumptions. This did not mean standing outside society, which is impossible. It meant practicing what Foucault called the art of not being governed quite so much. It meant questioning authorities, disobeying unjust rules, and experimenting with new ways of living. It meant treating one's own life as a work of art, constantly creating and recreating oneself rather than conforming to imposed identities. Nietzsche had ended his career in madness, his late writings becoming increasingly poetic and prophetic. Foucault maintained a clearer distinction between philosophical diagnosis and literary experimentation, but he shared Nietzsche's conviction that philosophy must serve life rather than abstract truth. He shared the belief that rigorous thought could be a practice of freedom, and he shared the commitment to questioning everything inherited, including the very practice of questioning itself. This Nietzschean conception of philosophy as diagnosis remains Foucault's most important legacy. It offers an alternative to both analytic philosophy's quest for timeless truths and continental philosophy's search for foundations. It transforms philosophy into a critical tool for understanding and transforming the present. And it insists that thinking can make a difference, not by discovering solutions, but by revealing the contingency of problems we thought were necessary. Beyond Marx and structuralism, Foucault's intellectual battle. Throughout his career, Foucault maintained a complex and often contentious relationship with two dominant intellectual movements, Marxism and structuralism. Understanding these relationships is essential for grasping what made his approach distinctive and why it provoked such intense debate. Foucault's first encounter with Marxism came early. In 1950, he joined the French Communist Party while studying at the École Normale Supérieure. This was common among young intellectuals of his generation. The party had emerged from World War II with enormous prestige, having led the resistance against Nazi occupation. For many, Marxism seemed the only coherent response to fascism and the only path towards social justice. But Foucault's membership lasted less than 3 years. He found the party's intellectual orthodoxy stifling. Soviet Marxism in this period insisted on dialectical materialism as scientific truth. Party intellectuals were expected to apply this framework to every question. Deviation was not tolerated. Foucault, whose temperament resisted all orthodoxies, could not accept this rigidity. He left the party in 1953. Yet leaving the party did not mean rejecting Marx entirely. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, French intellectual life was dominated by debates about how to read Marx properly. Should Marx be understood as a humanist philosopher, as existential Marxists argued, or as a scientist of history, as Louis Althusser claimed? Foucault participated in these debates, but always from an oblique angle. He neither fully accepted nor fully rejected Marxist categories. His main objection was that Marxism reduced too much to economics. Classical Marxism analyzed power primarily as class domination rooted in the ownership of the means of production. The state, law, culture, and ideology were all understood as reflections of economic base. Change the economic base through revolution, and the superstructure would follow. Foucault found this reductive. Power, he insisted, could not be explained solely through economic relations. Consider the prison. A Marxist analysis would explain imprisonment as serving capitalist interests. Prisons discipline the working class, create a reserve army of labor, and protect bourgeois property. There is truth in this analysis, but Foucault showed that disciplinary techniques emerged from multiple sources: military organization, religious practices, educational methods, medical observation. These techniques had their own logic and history, not reducible to class struggle. They spread throughout society not because capitalists imposed them, but because they proved effective for managing populations. Or consider sexuality. Marxist analysis linked sexual repression to bourgeois morality and capitalist family structure. Liberation would come through socialist revolution, which would free sexuality from economic constraints. But Foucault argued this missed how modern sexuality actually functioned. The Victorian bourgeoisie had not repressed sexuality but intensified discourse about it. They created an entire apparatus of confession, medical examination, and psychological interpretation. Sexual liberation movements, far from escaping this apparatus, often reinforced it by demanding ever more speech about sexuality. These critiques did not make Foucault anti-Marxist. He acknowledged Marx's importance and drew on Marxist insights throughout his work, but he insisted on pluralizing the analysis of power. Economic domination was one form among others. Power operated through multiple mechanisms, not all of which served class interests. Some forms of power predated capitalism, others might persist after capitalism's end. This stance infuriated orthodox Marxists. They accused Foucault of abandoning class struggle, betraying the working class, and serving bourgeois ideology by denying the primacy of economics. Foucault responded that he was trying to make left politics more effective by understanding how power actually operated. Focusing solely on economic exploitation meant ignoring the disciplinary mechanisms in schools, hospitals, and other institutions where people spent their lives. The relationship with structuralism was equally complex. In the mid-1960s, Foucault was labeled a structuralist, grouped with Claude Lévi-Strauss in anthropology, Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis, and Roland Barthes in literary criticism. This label was partly journalistic simplification, but there were genuine affinities. All these thinkers emphasized underlying structures rather than conscious intentions, systems rather than individuals, synchronic analysis rather than historical development. Structuralism originated in linguistics. Ferdinand de Saussure had argued that language is a system where meaning emerges from differences between signs rather than from reference to things. Subsequent thinkers applied this insight to other domains. Levi-Strauss analyzed kinship systems and myths as structured like languages. Lacan reread Freud to show how the unconscious is structured like a language. Barthes analyzed fashion, food, and popular culture as sign systems. Foucault shared certain structuralist commitments. He emphasized systems of rules that operated beneath individual consciousness. His archaeological method analyzed discourses as systems where meaning emerges from relations among statements. He bracketed questions of authorial intention and subjective experience. He treated the human subject not as the origin of meaning, but as an effect of structures. But Foucault consistently rejected the structuralist label. His reasons were multiple. First, structuralism sought universal structures underlying all human cultures. Levi-Strauss looked for the basic structures of human mind that manifested in all kinship systems and myths. Foucault, by contrast, emphasized historical discontinuity. The structures governing thought in one period bore no necessary relation to structures in another period. There was no transhistorical human nature or universal reason. Second, structuralism tended toward formalism. It analyzed systems abstractly, describing their internal logic without explaining how they arose or changed. Foucault wanted to understand transformations. Why did one episteme replace another? How did new forms of power emerge? These questions required historical and political analysis that pure structuralism could not provide. Third, structuralism seemed politically quietist. If behavior is determined by deep structures, what room exists for agency or resistance? Levi-Strauss explicitly opposed his structural anthropology to the existentialist emphasis on human freedom. Foucault, despite his critiques of humanism, insisted that people could resist power and transform themselves. Structure did not determine everything. By the early 1970s, Foucault had moved decisively beyond structuralism toward genealogy. Where structuralism sought timeless structures, genealogy traced historical emergence. Where structuralism bracketed power, genealogy made power central. Where structuralism analyzed closed systems, genealogy studied struggles, accidents, and transformations. This shift was connected to political developments. The May 1968 uprisings had shattered faith in established institutions. Students and workers rejected both capitalism and Soviet communism. They sought new forms of political organization and new theories to understand power. Structuralism, with its emphasis on systems that determined individuals, seemed inadequate. Genealogy, with its focus on resistance and transformation, better fit the revolutionary moment. Yet Foucault never fully abandoned structural analysis. His later work continued to analyze how systems of rules construct subjects. The difference was that he now emphasized how subjects could resist these systems, work on themselves, and create new modes of existence. Structure and agency were not opposites, but existed in tension. People are formed by power relations, but can also transform those relations through strategic action. The result was a position that satisfied neither orthodox Marxists nor orthodox structuralists. Marxists complained that Foucault ignored economics and class struggle. Structuralists complained that he abandoned scientific rigor for political engagement. Humanists complained that he denied human freedom and dignity. Foucault's response was that all these positions were too rigid. Reality was more complex than any single theoretical framework could capture. This intellectual independence came at a cost. Foucault was constantly attacked from multiple directions. The French Communist Party denounced him. Conservative academics dismissed him as a dangerous radical. Some feminists and anti-racist activists embraced his work while others criticized him for ignoring gender and race. He had no school, no orthodox followers, no party line. But this independence was also liberating. Foucault could draw on Marxism without being bound by its orthodoxies. He could use structural analysis without accepting structuralist premises. He could engage with phenomenology, psychoanalysis, and other traditions while remaining critical of each. His thought was genuinely synthetic, bringing together insights from disparate sources while maintaining a distinctive voice. The debates with Marx and structuralism reveal something essential about Foucault's method. He was not trying to build a totalizing theory that explained everything. He was developing a toolkit, a set of concepts and methods that could be applied to specific problems. Power, discourse, discipline, normalization. These were analytical tools, not elements of a closed system. They could be combined with insights from other traditions as needed. This pragmatic approach frustrated those who wanted clear theoretical positions. But it made Foucault's work extraordinarily fertile. Researchers could adopt his methods without accepting all his conclusions. They could apply his concepts to phenomena he never studied. They could critique his work while using his tools. The result was an explosion of Foucault-inspired research across multiple disciplines. The relationship with Marx remained especially important. Foucault insisted he was not anti-Marxist but post-Marxist. He accepted that economic exploitation matters but argued that power cannot be reduced to economics. He agreed that resistance and struggle are essential but rejected vanguard parties and revolutionary teleology. He wanted a left politics that attended to all the ways power operates, not just through the state and economy, but through everyday practices, expert knowledge, and technologies of the self. This position seems prescient today. Contemporary left movements often focus on issues Foucault highlighted: mass incarceration, police violence, surveillance, biopower, sexual and gender politics, psychiatric power, the medicalization of social problems. These cannot be understood through class analysis alone. They require the kind of nuanced analysis of power that Foucault pioneered. Similarly, his critique of structuralism anticipated later developments. Post-structuralism, as it came to be called, maintained structural analysis while emphasizing historical change, political struggle, and human agency. Thinkers like Jacques Derrida, Gilles Deleuze, and Julia Kristeva developed this approach in different ways. Foucault's work was central to this movement, even as he resisted being categorized within it. What emerges from these intellectual battles is a distinctive philosophical practice. Foucault refused grand narratives that explained everything. He rejected universal theories of human nature or historical progress. He insisted on analyzing specific phenomena in their historical specificity. But this did not mean abandoning theory. It meant developing flexible theoretical tools that could illuminate concrete problems without claiming to have solved them once and for all. Words and Things, The Order of Knowledge. In 1966, Foucault published The Order of Things, a book that would make him famous beyond academic philosophy. The French title was Les mots et les choses, Words and Things. The book's subtitle promised an archaeology of the human sciences. What it delivered was far stranger, a history of how Western thought has organized knowledge over the past 4 centuries. The book begins with a striking image. Foucault describes a passage from Jorge Luis Borges, who cites a Chinese encyclopedia that classifies animals into categories. Those belonging to the emperor, embalmed ones, tame ones, suckling pigs, mermaids, fabulous ones, stray dogs, those included in the present classification, those that tremble as if they were mad, innumerable ones, those drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, others, those that have just broken a flower vase, those that from a long way off look like flies. The sheer impossibility of thinking according to this taxonomy produces laughter. Yet Borges invented it to reveal something real. Every system of classification seems natural from within, but absurd from without. This insight drives the entire book. Foucault wanted to show that our current ways of organizing knowledge are no more natural than that Chinese encyclopedia. They simply seem natural because we live within them. To denaturalize them, he traced how European thought organized knowledge in three distinct periods: the Renaissance, the Classical Age, and modernity. Each period had its own episteme, a fundamental structure that determined what could be known and how. The Renaissance episteme, lasting roughly until the end of the 16th century, was organized around resemblance. Knowledge meant discovering the similitudes that connected all things. The universe was an infinite network of correspondences. Plants resembled the organs they could heal. Stars influenced human character through sympathetic relations. Words resembled things through hidden affinities. To know something meant to identify its place in this cosmic web of likenesses. This was not primitive thinking. Renaissance scholars conducted detailed empirical observations. They compiled enormous catalogs of plants, animals, and minerals. But their observations were guided by a search for resemblances. A plant with a leaf shaped like a liver must be good for liver ailments. This seemed perfectly logical within the episteme of resemblance. Around 1650, this entire framework collapsed. The classical age that followed organized knowledge completely differently. Resemblance was replaced by representation. Things no longer revealed their meanings through hidden similarities. Instead, they became objects that could be represented in transparent taxonomies. Knowledge meant creating orderly tables that classified everything according to visible characteristics. This was the age of natural history, not yet biology. Scientists like Linnaeus classified plants and animals into species, genera, families, orders. But they did so based on observable features: number of petals, shape of leaves, structure of bones. They did not yet ask about evolution or underlying causes. Classification was enough. To know was to assign each thing its proper place in a comprehensive system of differences and identities. Language too was understood as representation. Words were signs that represented ideas. The problem was to create a universal language where each idea had one clear sign. Philosophers like Leibniz dreamed of a characteristica universalis that would eliminate ambiguity. Grammar became the study of how ideas are represented in linguistic forms. The goal was transparency, perfect correspondence between thought and expression. Economics became the analysis of wealth. Value was understood through systems of exchange. Money represented wealth, just as words represented ideas. Thinkers tried to discover the natural laws governing trade and value, laws that would be as universal as the laws of physics. The economy was a system of representations that could be mapped and analyzed. But around 1800, another transformation occurred. The classical episteme of representation gave way to a modern episteme organized around very different principles. Biology replaced natural history. Instead of classifying visible characteristics, biology sought invisible causes: evolution, heredity, organic function. These explained why organisms appear as they do. Life became an autonomous force operating according to its own laws, irreducible to mechanical or chemical processes. Philology replaced general grammar. Language was no longer transparent representation but a historical reality with its own laws of development. Languages evolve, change, and die according to internal dynamics. Words do not simply represent ideas. They carry historical sediments, unconscious structures, cultural meanings that exceed any individual's intention. Political economy replaced the analysis of wealth. Value was no longer just exchange but production. Labor, capital, and technology combine to create wealth. Economic systems develop historically, passing through stages according to laws discoverable by science. Marx was possible only within this modern episteme, as was Darwin in biology and Nietzsche in philology. Most importantly, this modern episteme made possible a new object of knowledge: man, not humans as biological organisms, which had always existed, but man as a specific figure, the being who both knows and is known, who is simultaneously the subject and object of knowledge. The human sciences emerged to study this peculiar entity. Psychology studied human consciousness. Sociology studied human social organization. Anthropology studied human culture. But man, Foucault argued, is a recent invention. The concept only became thinkable around 1800 with the modern episteme. Before that, there was no unified figure of the human being as we understand it. There were souls, citizens, rational animals, but not man as the subject-object of the human sciences. This led to Foucault's most famous and controversial claim: man is a recent invention and perhaps nearing its end. If man emerged with a particular episteme, a new episteme might erase this figure as the classical age erased Renaissance resemblances. The human sciences might dissolve. Structuralism, which analyzed systems without reference to human subjects, might signal this dissolution. Foucault ended the book with the image of man disappearing like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea, erased by coming waves. This prediction scandalized humanists. They accused Foucault of nihilism, of denying human dignity and freedom, but Foucault was not advocating man's disappearance. He was diagnosing a transformation already underway. Structuralism, information theory, systems analysis, molecular biology, all these analyze complex systems without privileging human consciousness or intention. They suggested that man as organizing center might be a temporary historical construct. The book's method was archaeological. Foucault did not explain epistemic transformations causally. He did not say the classical episteme arose because of scientific discoveries or economic changes. He described the transformations as events, ruptures without necessary causes. This frustrated many readers. How could such fundamental changes occur without explanation? But Foucault insisted that searching for origins and causes often missed what was most important, the sheer fact of discontinuity. The order of things was enormously influential. It provided a framework for analyzing how knowledge is structured historically. It showed that categories we take as natural are historically contingent. It suggested that current ways of knowing are not permanent achievements but temporary formations. And it opened the possibility that future transformations might reorganize knowledge in ways we cannot yet imagine. Critics raised multiple objections. Some questioned Foucault's historical accuracy. Did Renaissance thinkers really organize all knowledge around resemblance? Were the breaks between epistemes as sharp as Foucault claimed? Others objected to the apparent determinism. If epistemes structure all thought, how can anyone think outside them? How did Foucault himself achieve the critical distance to describe epistemes? Foucault acknowledged some of these problems. He later admitted the book was too systematic, making historical transformations seem more unified than they were. He granted that power and social factors, largely absent from the order of things, needed to be integrated into the analysis. This would lead him toward genealogy and the study of power relations in his later work. But the book's central insight remained valid. Knowledge is not neutral or transparent. It is organized according to historical structures that determine what can be thought. These structures change over time in ways that are not simply progressive. Each episteme enables certain kinds of knowledge while making others impossible. And we remain largely blind to the episteme within which we think, mistaking its contingent rules for necessary truths. Understanding this has practical consequences. If our current categories and concepts are historically contingent, they can be questioned and transformed. The human sciences that emerged in the 19th century, with their claims to reveal human nature, can be understood as historically specific rather than universal. The concept of man that undergirds humanism can be seen as one possible way of thinking about humans, not the only way. This does not mean abandoning truth or knowledge. It means recognizing that truth and knowledge always exist within historical frameworks. There is no view from nowhere, no pure objectivity untouched by historical conditions. But this recognition enables a different kind of critical practice. We can analyze how our current frameworks enable and constrain thought. We can seek their limits and explore possibilities they exclude. The Order of Things remains Foucault's most systematic work of pure archaeology. Later books would combine archaeological analysis with genealogical study of power, but this book established the archaeological method and demonstrated its power. It showed that intellectual history could be written in a radically new way, attending to the deep structures that make thought possible rather than the ideas of individual thinkers. The Invention and Death of Man. At the center of the Order of Things stands Foucault's most provocative claim. Man is an invention of recent date, and perhaps nearing its end. This claim requires careful unpacking. Foucault was not denying that human beings have always existed. He was arguing that a specific concept of the human, which emerged only in the 19th century, might be dissolving in the 20th. To understand this, we must distinguish between humans as biological organisms and man as a philosophical concept. Humans have existed for hundreds of thousands of years. People have thought about human nature, human society, and human destiny for millennia. But Foucault argued that a very specific figure, which he called man with a capital M, only became possible around 1800. What characterized this figure of man? First, man was defined as an empirical transcendental doublet. This philosophical jargon points to something crucial. Man was understood as both an object that could be studied empirically by the human sciences and as the subject who conducts that study. Man is the being who both knows and is known, who investigates nature while being part of nature, who analyzes culture while being shaped by culture. This created a peculiar philosophical problem. How can the same entity be both the foundation of knowledge and an object of knowledge? How can human beings study themselves scientifically when they are the ones doing the studying? This circularity was built into the very concept of man. The human sciences could never achieve the same objectivity as physics, because the observer was also the observed. Second, man was defined as a finite being whose limitations were also the conditions of knowledge. Earlier philosophers like Descartes had grounded knowledge in the infinity of God or pure reason. But modern thought, emerging from Kant, understood human knowledge as limited by human finitude. We can only know things as they appear to us, structured by our cognitive apparatus. We cannot know things in themselves. This finitude was not a defect to overcome, but the very ground of human existence. Man was the being who lives, labors, and speaks. These three activities, studied by biology, economics, and philology respectively, defined human existence. Each revealed human limitations, biological mortality, economic scarcity, linguistic constraints. Yet these limitations were also what made human life meaningful. Mortality gave urgency to existence. Scarcity necessitated labor and exchange. Language made thought and communication possible. Third, man was defined by a specific temporal structure. Unlike earlier conceptions that saw human nature as fixed, modern thought understood humans as historical beings. Man had an origin that could be studied scientifically through evolution, archaeology, and philology. Man developed through stages that economics and sociology could map, and man might have a destiny, an end toward which history moved. This historical understanding created new questions. What is the relationship between human nature and human history? Do unchanging structures underlie historical change, or is human nature itself historical? Can we discover laws of historical development, or is history ultimately contingent? These questions animated the human sciences throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The human sciences emerged to study this curious entity. Psychology investigated human consciousness and behavior. Sociology analyzed human social organization. Anthropology studied human cultural diversity. These disciplines claimed scientific status, modeling themselves on the natural sciences, but they faced a problem. Their object, man, was also their subject. The psychologist studying cognition uses cognition to do so. The sociologist studying society is part of society. This circularity was inescapable. Foucault argued that the human sciences were constantly unstable because of this structure. They oscillated between two poles. Either they reduced man to empirical determinations, explaining human behavior through biology, economics, or culture, thus dissolving the autonomous subject who was supposed to ground knowledge, or they appealed to transcendental structures of consciousness or language, positing a human nature that escaped empirical determination but then could not be studied scientifically. This instability appeared in specific debates. Psychologists argued about whether behavior is determined by biological instincts or shaped by environment and learning. Sociologists debated whether social structures determine individual action or individuals create structures through interaction. Anthropologists questioned whether human cultures share universal features or are incommensurably different. These debates were not accidental. They stemmed from the contradictory structure of man as empirico-transcendental doublet. By the mid-20th century, several developments suggested man might be dissolving. Structuralism analyzed systems without reference to human subjects. Linguistics studied language as an autonomous system. Anthropology revealed how cultures structure thought. Psychoanalysis showed consciousness determined by unconscious processes. Information theory and cybernetics modeled intelligence without consciousness. Molecular biology reduced life to chemical processes. These approaches did not deny that humans exist. They questioned whether human consciousness or intention plays the foundational role that modern philosophy assigned it. They suggested that humans are nodes in larger systems: linguistic, cultural, biological, informational. The system, not the subject, was primary. Man as the autonomous center of meaning and action was decentered. Foucault saw this decentering as potentially liberating. The concept of man had authorized the human sciences to claim knowledge of human nature, essence, and destiny. It had grounded humanistic ethics that purported to speak for universal humanity. But this humanism had often served power. Colonial administrators justified imperialism by claiming to bring civilization to peoples without history. Psychiatrists justified confinement by claiming to treat abnormal minds. Educators normalized children by claiming to develop their human potential. If man is a historical construct rather than eternal truth, these claims lose their foundation. We can ask how specific conceptions of human nature emerged and whose interests they served. We can question whether universal humanity actually exists or whether this concept obscures differences of culture, gender, race, and class. We can imagine different ways of being human not constrained by the figure of man. This argument was easily misunderstood. Critics accused Foucault of denying human dignity, freedom, and rights. If humans are just effects of systems, how can we ground ethics or politics? How can we resist oppression? But Foucault was not denying that humans have capacities for thought, action, and resistance. He was questioning a specific philosophical concept that claimed to ground these capacities in a universal human nature. His point was that humanism, despite its emancipatory claims, had often functioned as a technology of normalization. By defining what it means to be truly human, humanism authorized institutions to correct, treat, or exclude those who deviated from this norm. The mental patient, the criminal, the colonized subject, the sexual deviant, all were measured against an ideal of man and found wanting. An anti-humanist position, in Foucault's sense, did not mean indifference to human suffering. It meant refusing to ground ethics in abstract concepts of human nature. Instead, ethics would emerge from concrete struggles against specific forms of domination. Different groups would define their own goals rather than appealing to universal humanity. This pluralism seemed more democratic than humanism's claim to speak for all. The death of man announced in the order of things was thus not a catastrophe but a possibility. If the modern episteme that made man thinkable is transforming, what might emerge? Foucault did not claim to know. He suggested that we might be entering a period where the human as organizing center of knowledge gives way to something else. This something else was not yet clear, but its outlines were becoming visible in structural analysis, systems theory, and molecular biology. In retrospect, Foucault's prediction was both prescient and premature. The human sciences did not disappear. Psychology, sociology, and anthropology remain active disciplines. Humanism remains influential in ethics and politics. The figure of man persists in both academic and popular thought. But Foucault was right that this figure is contested. Post-humanism questions the boundary between human and animal, human and machine. Feminism reveals how supposedly universal man has actually been modeled on male experience. Post-colonial theory shows how humanity was defined through exclusion of the colonized. Disability studies challenges normative conceptions of human capability. These movements do not simply extend humanism to include more people. They question the concept of a unified human nature. Moreover, contemporary developments in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and information systems raise new questions about human distinctiveness. If machines can think, if biology can be engineered, if consciousness is a computational process, what remains of man as traditionally conceived? These are not merely theoretical questions, but practical issues reshaping how humans live and understand themselves. Foucault's analysis of the invention and potential death of man thus remains relevant. It reminds us that our current ways of thinking about humanity are not timeless truths, but historical constructions. It opens space for questioning what it means to be human without assuming we already know the answer. And it suggests that defending human dignity might require abandoning humanism's claim to define universal human nature. Madness and Civilization, Silencing Unreason. Foucault's first major book appeared in 1961 under the title Folie et déraison, Histoire de la folie à l'âge classique. In English, it became Madness and Civilization, a much shorter version that nonetheless captured the book's revolutionary claim. What we call mental illness is not a timeless medical reality, but a historical construct, a way that society has dealt with what disturbs its order. The book begins in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. During this period, Foucault argued, madness had a very different status than it would later acquire. Mad people were not systematically confined or medically treated. They lived within communities, though often at the margins. Some wandered freely, others were sent away on ships, the famous ships of fools that appear in Renaissance art and literature. But more importantly, madness retained a certain truth value. The mad fool could speak truths that others could not or dared not speak. In Shakespeare's King Lear, the fool tells truths about power and folly that the supposedly sane characters cannot see. In paintings by Hieronymus Bosch, madness reveals moral and spiritual truths about human nature. Madness was connected to unreason, to the irrational and the chaotic, but this unreason was not simply negative. It revealed something real about the human condition. This relationship between reason and unreason was transformed in the 17th century through what Foucault called the Great Confinement. Beginning around 1650, European societies undertook a massive campaign to confine various marginal populations. In Paris, the Hôpital General was established to house the poor, the unemployed, the criminal, and the mad together. Similar institutions appeared across Europe. Within a few decades, 1% of the population of Paris was confined in such institutions. This was not yet medical confinement. The institutions were not hospitals in the modern sense. They were administrative centers where social order was enforced. The mad were not treated for illness, but punished for disturbing public order. They were mixed with beggars, blasphemers, libertines, and idlers. What united these diverse groups was that they represented unreason, the negation of reason that the age of reason could not tolerate. The classical age, from roughly 1650 to 1800, thus excluded madness from society through confinement. But it did not yet medicalize madness. The mad were not patients, but prisoners. They were not studied scientifically, but morally condemned. Madness was understood as a moral failing, a surrender to passion and unreason, rather than as a medical condition. This exclusion was connected to broader philosophical developments. The 17th century was the age of Descartes, who grounded philosophy in the certainty of the thinking subject. I think, therefore I am. But to establish this certainty, Descartes had to exclude the possibility of being mad. He could doubt whether his perceptions were real, whether he was dreaming, whether a demon was deceiving him, but he could not doubt that he was thinking. Madness, which would undermine the thinking subject itself, had to be expelled from philosophy at its foundation. This philosophical exclusion paralleled the social exclusion in houses of confinement. Both established the sovereignty of reason by silencing unreason. Madness could no longer speak. It could no longer reveal truth. It became pure negativity, the absence of reason that reason defined itself against. The dialogue between reason and unreason that had existed in the Renaissance was replaced by reason's monologue about madness. Around 1800, another transformation occurred. Madness was transferred from houses of confinement to asylums. This was presented as humanitarian reform. Philippe Pinel in France and William Tuke in England unchained the mad, removing physical restraints. They created therapeutic environments where madness could be treated rather than simply punished. But Foucault argued this reform was ambiguous. Physical chains were replaced by psychological controls. The asylum became a total institution where the mad were subjected to constant surveillance and moral judgment. Psychiatry emerged as a medical discipline claiming scientific authority over madness. But this medical model, Foucault showed, retained moral assumptions. The mad were still judged as having failed to properly master themselves. The key technique was moral treatment. Patients were rewarded for behaving rationally and punished for behaving madly. They were taught to internalize shame for their condition and to strive towards self-control. The psychiatrist became a figure of authority whose gaze patients internalized. The asylum was organized to produce this internalization. Constant observation, regular schedules, productive work, all aimed at reforming the patient into a reasonable subject. This was the birth of modern psychiatry. Foucault traced how various conditions were identified, classified, and explained. Mania, melancholia, dementia, neurosis, each acquired a medical definition. Symptoms were catalogued, causes debated, treatments developed. Psychiatry claimed to be discovering the truth about mental illness through objective scientific investigation. But Foucault argued that psychiatry was not simply discovering pre-existing mental illnesses. It was constructing them through its practices of observation, classification, and intervention. The asylum created the conditions under which certain behaviors became visible as symptoms. Medical discourse organized these symptoms into disease entities. Treatment practices produced the outcomes that confirmed psychiatric theories. This was not to deny that people experience psychological suffering. Foucault was not claiming mental illness is simply invented or that psychiatry has no therapeutic value. His point was more subtle, that the specific ways we understand and respond to psychological distress are historically contingent. Mental illness as we know it required the asylum, psychiatric expertise, and medical discourse to take shape. The book concluded with reflections on the modern situation. Foucault suggested that Freud and psychoanalysis represented both a culmination and potential transformation of psychiatry. Freud retained the psychiatrist's authority and the medical model, but psychoanalysis also gave madness a voice again through free association and dream interpretation. It suggested that unreason contains truth that reason cannot access directly. Yet psychoanalysis still operated within the structure established by the asylum. It maintained the division between doctor and patient, sanity and madness. It claimed to cure by restoring patients to normality. For Foucault, the question remained, Could madness ever truly speak again, or would it always be translated and domesticated by psychiatric discourse? The book's impact was enormous but contested. Anti-psychiatry movements in the 1960s and 1970s cited Foucault to argue that mental hospitals should be closed and forced treatment ended. Some psychiatrists accused him of denying mental illness exists. Historians questioned his account of the Great Confinement and whether he had overgeneralized from French sources. Foucault later acknowledged that the book was flawed. He had tried to write a history of madness itself, giving voice to Unreason, but this was impossible. He could only access madness through the discourse that had silenced it. The dream of letting madness speak in its own voice was naive. Later work would be more careful about the limits of historical recovery. But the book's central insights remain powerful. It established that mental illness is not simply a natural kind discovered by medical science. It is a historically constructed category shaped by institutional practices, expert discourses, and power relations. It showed that humanitarian reforms can create new forms of control more subtle than what they replace. And it raised questions about the relationship between normality and abnormality, reason and unreason that continue to resonate. The medical gaze, the birth of the clinic. In 1963, 2 years after Madness and Civilization, Foucault published The Birth of the Clinic. The French title was more revealing, Naissance de la Clinique, une archéologie du regard médical, or Birth of the Clinic, an archaeology of the medical gaze. The book examined how modern medicine emerged at the end of the 18th century through a transformation in how doctors looked at disease, bodies, and death. Before this transformation, medicine operated according to a different logic. In the classical period of the 17th and 18th centuries, illness was understood as an abstract entity that afflicted bodies but existed independently of them. Diseases were classified like plants in botanical taxonomies. Each disease had its essential characteristics, its natural course, its proper treatment. The individual patient was almost incidental, merely the site where a disease manifested. Doctors of this period focused on symptoms, what the patient reported feeling. Pain, fever, weakness, these subjective experiences were the primary data. The doctor listened to the patient's account, compared it to established disease classifications, and prescribed treatment based on general principles. There was relatively little examination of the patient's body. What mattered was identifying which disease entity was present. This began to change around 1800 with the emergence of clinical medicine. The clinic, in Foucault's sense, was not just a physical location, but a new way of organizing medical knowledge and practice. At its center was a transformed medical gaze, a new way of seeing that made the body's interior visible to systematic investigation. Several institutional developments made this possible. First, hospitals became sites of medical teaching rather than merely charitable institutions for the poor. Medical students learned by observing many cases of the same disease, comparing symptoms and outcomes. This required concentrating patients in centralized locations where doctors could study them systematically. Second, pathological anatomy became central to medical knowledge. Doctors began performing systematic autopsies, correlating the lesions they found in corpses with the symptoms patients had shown while alive. The question became, what visible changes in organs and tissues correspond to this disease? Death became an epistemological tool, the moment when the truth of the disease could finally be seen. Third, the clinic established new relationships between the visible and the invisible. Doctors developed techniques to make the body's interior accessible without surgery. Percussion, tapping the body to hear differences in sound. Auscultation, listening to internal sounds with instruments like the stethoscope, invented in 1816. These techniques extended the medical gaze beneath the skin. This transformation reorganized how disease was understood. Disease was no longer an abstract entity, but a specific alteration in bodily organs and tissues. Each disease had a characteristic lesion that could be identified through autopsy or clinical examination. The patient's subjective experience became secondary to objective signs that doctors could observe and measure. Consider the case of tuberculosis. In the 18th century, consumption was classified by symptoms: wasting, cough, fever. Different forms might be treated as different diseases. In the 19th century, clinical medicine unified these under tuberculosis, defined by specific lesions in the lungs visible at autopsy. The symptom became less important than the underlying pathology. This new medicine claimed to be more scientific, more objective. It replaced the patient's uncertain reports with the doctor's trained observation. It discovered the physical reality of disease beneath variable symptoms. But Foucault showed that this objectivity came at a cost. The patient's experience, the lived reality of illness, was marginalized. The patient became a body to be examined rather than a person to be consulted. The clinical gaze also transformed the relationship between illness and death. In earlier medicine, death was the opposite of medical knowledge, the point where medicine failed. But clinical medicine made death productive. The corpse revealed truths about life. Autopsy became essential to medical education. Students learned to see living patients as potential corpses, to imagine the lesions that would eventually be revealed. Foucault identified this as a profound shift in European attitudes toward death and the body. Death was integrated into positive knowledge rather than remaining beyond comprehension. The corpse was no longer sacred or fearsome, but became an object of scientific investigation. This desacralization enabled medical progress, but also alienated humans from their own mortality. The birth of the clinic also changed medical language. Earlier medical texts were qualitative, describing symptoms in rich detail. Clinical medicine developed a new language of localization and measurement. Where is the lesion? How large? What tissue is affected? This language could be standardized, taught, replicated. It made medicine communicable across distances and cultures. But this language also excluded certain experiences. Chronic pain, fatigue, distress, conditions without clear lesions became difficult to classify. Patients reporting symptoms without objective signs were suspected of malingering or hysteria. The body that medicine could see became more real than the body patients experienced. Foucault traced how specific diseases were reconfigured through clinical medicine. Fever, once a disease entity itself, became a symptom of underlying pathology. Neurosis, lacking visible lesions, occupied an ambiguous status between mental and physical illness. Cancer became identifiable through its cellular characteristics rather than its course. Each transformation revealed the power of the medical gaze to reorganize the field of the visible. The clinic also established new hierarchies of medical knowledge. Surgeons who worked with visible anatomical structures gained prestige over physicians who relied on theory. Hospital doctors who could study many cases claimed authority over rural practitioners. Specialists focusing on specific organs or systems emerged. Medical knowledge became increasingly technical, requiring extended training and institutional credentials. This professionalization had political dimensions. Doctors claimed authority not just over individual patients, but over public health. They advised governments on sanitation, quarantine, and population management. Medical knowledge became essential to state administration. The doctor emerged as a figure of social authority, not through personal wisdom, but through technical expertise. Foucault showed how the clinic was connected to broader political developments. The French Revolution had proclaimed health a universal right, but realizing this right required medical knowledge and institutional infrastructure. The clinic emerged as the solution, a space where poor patients could be treated while simultaneously serving as objects of medical study. Their bodies provided the material for medical education in exchange for charity. This exchange had an ambiguous character. On one hand, it extended medical care to populations previously excluded. On the other hand, it made the poor into experimental subjects. Their bodies were examined, displayed to students, used for medical research in ways wealthy patients could refuse. The clinic thus embodied social inequalities even while claiming to serve universal health. The book concluded by noting that clinical medicine's triumph was not final. Even as it established itself, new challenges emerged. Diseases without lesions, mental illnesses that resisted anatomical explanation, functional disorders where organs appeared normal but did not work properly. These pushed medicine beyond the anatomical model toward physiology, biochemistry, and eventually molecular biology. But the clinical gaze established by 19th century medicine remained foundational. It trained doctors to see bodies as collections of organs and systems. It prioritized objective signs over subjective symptoms. It made the patient's body, rather than their experience, the locus of truth. These assumptions continue to structure modern medicine despite subsequent developments. The birth of the clinic received less attention than madness and civilization. It was more technical, focused on medical history rather than broader philosophical themes. But it demonstrated Foucault's archaeological method applied to a new domain. It showed how a scientific discipline emerged not through pure discovery, but through institutional reorganization and transformed ways of seeing. The book also connected to Foucault's larger project. Like the asylum, the clinic was a space where individuals were observed, classified, and normalized. Like psychiatry, clinical medicine claimed scientific objectivity while encoding social values. Like the human sciences, medicine constructed its objects through practices of investigation. The clinic was another instance of how modern institutions produce knowledge and power simultaneously. For contemporary readers, the book raises questions about medical practice today. How do technologies like MRI and genetic testing extend the medical gaze? Do they make bodies more transparent or create new forms of opacity? How does evidence-based medicine, with its statistical methods, transform clinical judgment? What experiences of illness remain invisible to medical investigation? How do patients negotiate between their lived experience and medical authority? These questions suggest the book's continuing relevance. Medicine has changed enormously since the early 19th century, but the basic structure Foucault identified, where observation produces knowledge that authorizes intervention, remains central. Understanding this structure helps us think critically about medical power without simply rejecting medical science. From spectacle to surveillance, discipline and punish. In 1975, Foucault published Surveiller et punir, naissance de la prison, translated as Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison. This would become his most famous and influential book, radically changing how people understood power, punishment, and modern institutions. The book opens with a shocking contrast. First, Foucault describes in graphic detail the execution of Robert-François Damiens in 1757. Damiens had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV. His punishment was public torture of extreme cruelty. His flesh was torn with red-hot pincers. Molten lead, boiling oil, burning sulfur were poured into his wounds. Horses were attached to his limbs to pull him apart. The execution lasted hours before Damiens finally died. Then Foucault presents a prison timetable from 1837, less than a century later. Prisoners rise at a set hour. They work, eat, and sleep according to rigid schedules. Every moment is regulated. Activities are supervised, silence is enforced, but there is no physical torture, no public spectacle. This contrast poses the book's central question. How did we get from spectacular public torture to bureaucratic prison routine in less than a century? The usual answer is that punishment became more humane, that Enlightenment values replaced barbaric cruelty with rational restraint. But Foucault argues the transformation was more complex. Punishment did not become less severe, it became different in kind, targeting different objects through different mechanisms. Public torture under the monarchy was a political ritual. When someone committed a crime, especially a serious crime, they injured the sovereign's power. Crime was an attack on the king's law, hence on the king himself. Punishment had to restore the sovereign's power through visible demonstration of overwhelming force. The criminal's body became the site where royal power was reaffirmed through spectacular suffering. This was not irrational cruelty, it was a calculated technology of power. The public execution was carefully staged, the condemned was paraded through streets, the execution followed prescribed procedures. The crowd was invited to witness. If the criminal confessed and repented, royal mercy might commute the sentence. The entire spectacle communicated messages about power, justice, and order. But this system was unstable. Public executions sometimes backfired. Crowds might sympathize with the condemned rather than with authority. Executions could spark riots. The spectacle meant to affirm power sometimes revealed its limits. Moreover, as Enlightenment reformers pointed out, torture was arbitrary and excessive. Similar crimes received wildly different punishments. Torture might extract false confessions. The whole system seemed barbaric and inefficient. Reform movements in the late 18th century proposed a different model. Punishment should be certain, proportional, and rational. Every crime should have a fixed penalty. Punishment should fit the crime, neither excessive nor insufficient. The goal should be deterrence, not vengeance. This seemed more humane and more effective. But the actual outcome was not what reformers intended. Instead of graded penalties varied by crime, a single institution came to dominate punishment, the prison. By the mid-19th century, imprisonment had become the standard penalty for almost all crimes. Why? Not because reformers advocated it. Most reformers actually opposed imprisonment as ineffective. The prison emerged through a different logic. Foucault identified this logic as discipline. The prison was one instance of disciplinary techniques that appeared across many institutions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Schools, factories, hospitals, barracks. These techniques aim not to punish crime but to transform individuals, to produce useful and docile bodies. Discipline operated through several mechanisms. First, spatial distribution. Individuals were assigned to fixed locations where they could be observed. Classrooms with rows of desks, factory floors with workstations, prison cells. This spatial organization made populations manageable. Second, temporal control. Activities were broken down into sequences. Each moment had its assigned task. Time was measured, regulated, optimized. Workers performed repetitive motions. Students followed schedules. Soldiers drilled in precise formations. This temporal organization made bodies efficient. Third, hierarchical observation. Discipline required constant surveillance. Supervisors watched workers. Teachers monitored students. Guards observed prisoners. This observation did not have to be continuous. What mattered was that individuals never knew when they were being watched, so they had to act as if always observed. Fourth, normalizing judgment. Discipline did not just prohibit certain acts. It established norms and ranked individuals according to them. Students were graded, workers were evaluated, prisoners were assessed. Those who met norms were rewarded. Those who fell short were corrected through additional training. The goal was not punishment, but normalization. Fifth, examination. This combined observation and judgment. The exam made individuals into cases, into objects of knowledge and targets of power simultaneously. School exams measured student learning. Medical exams assessed patient health. Prison assessments determined release eligibility. Examination produced records, files, documentation that followed individuals through life. These techniques created what Foucault called disciplinary power. Unlike sovereign power, which demanded obedience through threat of violence, disciplinary power worked through training and normalization. It did not just repress but produce certain kinds of subjects: students who learned, workers who labored efficiently, soldiers who obeyed orders, prisoners who internalized rules. The prison concentrated all these disciplinary techniques. It isolated individuals in cells. It organized time through rigid schedules. It subjected prisoners to constant observation. It classified them according to criminal types. It examined them to determine progress toward reform. The prison was a laboratory where disciplinary power could be applied in its purest form. But the prison had a paradox. It claimed to reform criminals, but consistently failed. Recidivism rates were high from the beginning. Ex-prisoners often returned to crime. The prison seemed to produce delinquency rather than eliminate it. Reformers recognized this failure from the start. For nearly 2 centuries, prison reform movements have pointed out that prisons do not work. Yet prisons persist and expand. Why? Foucault argued that the prison succeeds precisely through its apparent failure. By producing a specific criminal class, delinquents who can be tracked and managed, the prison makes illegality useful to power. Delinquency can be used to control working-class populations, to justify police surveillance, to divide legal from illegal workers. The prison creates the very problem it claims to solve, but this problem serves political purposes. This analysis extended beyond prisons. Foucault argued that disciplinary techniques had spread throughout modern society. Schools discipline children into students. Hospitals discipline patients into following medical regimens. Factories discipline workers into productive laborers. The military disciplines recruits into soldiers. These institutions all use similar techniques: spatial organization, temporal control, hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, examination. The result is what Foucault called a disciplinary society. Power in modernity does not primarily operate through spectacular displays of violence. It operates through subtle mechanisms that train bodies, organize populations, and normalize behavior. We internalize discipline, policing ourselves without need for external coercion. This makes modern power more efficient, but also more total than pre-modern sovereign power. Foucault was careful to note that disciplinary power did not replace sovereign power. Sovereign power persists. States still execute criminals in some places. Police still use violence. But discipline became the dominant mode of power in modern societies, operating continuously and mundanely where sovereign power intervened only exceptionally. Discipline and punish transformed multiple fields. Historians studied how institutions disciplined populations. Sociologists analyzed surveillance and normalization. Criminologists critiqued prisons from new angles. Legal scholars examined how law produces subjects. The book provided theoretical tools that researchers applied to phenomena Foucault never discussed, from schools to hospitals to workplaces to digital surveillance. The book also drew criticism. Some historians questioned Foucault's account of when and how prisons emerged. Some argued he overstated discontinuity between pre-modern and modern punishment. Others objected that he ignored resistance, presenting discipline as total and inescapable. Still others pointed out that sovereign power remains more important than Foucault acknowledged, especially for marginalized populations. Foucault addressed some critiques in later work. He acknowledged that he had not adequately theorized resistance in this book. He clarified that disciplinary power was a tendency, not an accomplished totality. He He insisted that power always produces resistance, that normalization never fully succeeds. But the book's basic framework remained his most influential contribution to analyzing modern power. The Panopticon, you are being watched even when you're not. At the center of Discipline and Punish stands Foucault's analysis of the Panopticon, an architectural design that became his most famous metaphor for modern power. The Panopticon was not Foucault's invention. It was designed in 1791 by Jeremy Bentham, an English philosopher and social reformer. But Foucault recognized in this design the diagram of a new form of power that would come to dominate modern societies. The Panopticon was Bentham's plan for an ideal prison. The building would be circular. At the center would stand a watchtower. Around the perimeter would be individual cells. Each cell would have 2 windows, one facing the center tower, one facing outside. Light from the outer window would illuminate the cell's interior, making the prisoner visible to observers in the tower. But the tower would have blinds and partitions, making observers invisible to prisoners. This created a simple but profound effect. Prisoners could never know when they were being watched. An observer might be in the tower at any moment, or not. The prisoner had no way to tell. Therefore, the prisoner had to assume constant observation. They had to behave as if always watched, even when alone. This assumption would produce self-discipline. The prisoner would internalize the observer's gaze, becoming their own guardian. External surveillance would create internal self-control. The prisoner would police themselves. As Bentham wrote, the Panopticon ensured that persons to be inspected should always feel themselves as if under inspection. Bentham believed this design could be applied far beyond prisons. He proposed Panopticon schools, where teachers could observe all students simultaneously. Panopticon factories, where managers could supervise all workers. Panopticon hospitals, where doctors could monitor all patients. The design was universal, applicable anywhere discipline was needed. Foucault seized on the Panopticon as the defining diagram of disciplinary power. It revealed the fundamental mechanism through which modern power operates, not through direct violence or constant physical presence, but through a gaze that makes itself unnecessary by becoming internalized. The Panopticon automated and disindividualized power. It did not matter who occupied the tower, the structure itself produced the disciplinary effect. This was radically different from earlier forms of power. Sovereign power required spectacle, the king displaying his might through ceremonies and executions. Disciplinary power required invisibility. Power works best when unseen. Sovereign power was concentrated in a single figure. Disciplinary power was distributed throughout a structure. Sovereign power operated through exceptional interventions. Disciplinary power operated through continuous surveillance. The genius of the Panopticon was its economy. A single observer, or even no observer, could control many individuals. Compare this to older forms of imprisonment. Dungeons required heavy chains, thick walls, armed guards. Escape required breaking physical barriers. The Panopticon required only visibility. Escape was prevented not by physical impossibility, but by the prisoner's knowledge that any attempt would be seen. This made discipline far more efficient than repression. You do not need to constantly punish people to control them. You only need to create conditions where they might be observed at any moment. The uncertainty itself produces compliance. People discipline themselves to avoid potential punishment, even when punishment is unlikely. Foucault showed that while Bentham's literal Panopticon was rarely built, its principles spread throughout modern institutions. Schools adopted classroom arrangements where teachers could observe all students. Factories organized production lines for managerial oversight. Hospitals designed wards for medical surveillance. Office buildings created open plans for supervisor visibility. The panoptic principle became embedded in modern architecture and institutional organization. But the Panopticon was not just architecture. It represented a technology of power that extended beyond buildings. Record keeping created documentary surveillance. Files followed individuals through institutions. School records, medical histories, employment records, credit reports, criminal records. These documents made individuals visible to institutional authorities across time and space. Examinations implemented panoptic power. Tests made students perform under observation. Medical exams made bodies visible to clinical gaze. Job interviews made applicants demonstrate fitness. These examinations produced data that institutions used to classify, rank, and normalize individuals. The exam was observation formalized and documented. Hierarchies of surveillance multiplied observers. In factories, floor supervisors watched workers while being watched by managers who were watched by executives. In schools, teachers observed students, while principals observed teachers, while inspectors observed principals. Each level monitored the level below, creating pyramids of surveillance. Foucault argued that modern societies were becoming increasingly panoptic. Surveillance technologies multiplied. Police developed systems for tracking populations. Governments created databases of citizens. Employers monitored workers. Credit agencies compiled financial histories. The principle of potential observation at any moment spread through social space. This analysis seemed prescient as surveillance technologies advanced. Closed-circuit television cameras in public spaces, metal detectors in schools, drug testing in workplaces, electronic monitoring of parolees, internet tracking of online behavior, data mining of consumer purchases, facial recognition in crowds. Each development extended panoptic logic into new domains. The digital age intensified these trends. Smartphones track location constantly. Social media platforms monitor user behavior. Search engines record queries. Smart home devices listen continuously. Fitness trackers measure bodily activity. Cars report driving patterns. The Internet of Things creates comprehensive surveillance of daily life. These technologies differ from Bentham's prison tower. The observation is not centralized but dispersed across multiple platforms and institutions. Often we volunteer information rather than being forcibly monitored. The surveillance is bidirectional. We can observe others as they observe us. But the panoptic principle remains. Awareness of potential observation produces self-discipline. Consider social media. Users know their posts might be viewed by employers, parents, partners, strangers. This awareness shapes what they post. They curate online personas, managing their visibility. They discipline themselves without direct coercion, simply through knowledge that they are potentially observed. The platform enables this self-surveillance while claiming to provide freedom of expression. Or consider workplace surveillance. Employers track emails, monitor internet usage, measure productivity metrics. Workers know their behavior generates data that influences evaluations. They adjust their conduct accordingly, working as if always observed even when supervisors are absent. The technology automates panoptic surveillance that once required human observers. Foucault's analysis helps us understand why such surveillance proliferates despite resistance. The Panopticon does not just repress, but produces. It produces knowledge about populations, produces efficient behavior, produces disciplined subjects. Institutions adopt surveillance not from malice, but because it makes management easier. The Panopticon is seductive to power because it works. But Foucault also noted limitations. Panoptic surveillance is never total. There are always blind spots, moments of invisibility, spaces outside observation. Prisoners find ways to communicate despite surveillance. Students cheat despite teacher observation. Workers resist despite monitoring. The panoptic principle creates pressure towards self-discipline but never fully achieves it. Moreover, awareness of surveillance can produce resistance rather than compliance. When people recognize they are being watched, they may refuse to perform as expected. They may sabotage surveillance systems, provide false data, or organize collective resistance. Visibility can enable control, but also makes power vulnerable to opposition. Contemporary debates about privacy, surveillance, and data collection continue themes Foucault identified. Should governments collect metadata on communications? Should employers monitor emails? Should schools use facial recognition? Should tech companies track users? These are not just legal or technical questions, but political questions about what kind of society we want to inhabit. Foucault did not answer such questions with simple prescriptions. He provided analytical tools for understanding what is at stake. The Panopticon reveals that modern power operates through visibility and self-discipline rather than force. Recognizing this helps us see surveillance not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a political choice with consequences for freedom, autonomy, and resistance. The metaphor remains powerful because it captures something essential about modern existence. We increasingly live in conditions where we might be observed at any moment. This creates pressure to constantly manage our visibility, to perform acceptable identities, to internalize social norms. The Panopticon is not just a prison design, but a description of how life feels under contemporary conditions of surveillance. The evolution of power, from execution to optimization. Foucault's analysis of power transformed political theory. Traditional political philosophy had focused almost exclusively on sovereignty. Who has legitimate authority? How is it established? What are its limits? Foucault argued that focusing only on sovereignty misses how power actually operates in modern societies. He identified three distinct forms of power that coexist and overlap: sovereign power, disciplinary power, and biopower. Sovereign power was the dominant form in European societies from the Middle Ages through the 18th century. It operated through a simple principle: the sovereign had the right to take life or let live. The king could kill anyone who violated his laws or threatened his authority. This right was rarely exercised, but its possibility grounded all sovereign power. Subjects obeyed because disobedience risked death. This power was visible and spectacular. It concentrated in the person of the sovereign, who embodied political authority. When exercised, it appeared as dramatic intervention, public executions, military displays, royal ceremonies. Power was something possessed by the sovereign and wielded against subjects. It operated negatively through prohibition and punishment. Sovereign power did not concern itself with everyday life. The king cared whether subjects obeyed laws and paid taxes, not how they organized their time or conducted their relationships. Power intervened only when subjects violated explicit prohibitions. The rest of life remained relatively untouched by political authority. Disciplinary power emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, becoming dominant by the 19th century. It operated through a different principle, training individuals into useful, efficient, and docile subjects. Where sovereign power took life or let live, disciplinary power made live in specific ways. It did not threaten death, but shaped life. This power was dispersed through institutions, schools, hospitals, prisons, factories, barracks. It did not concentrate in a single figure, but distributed across multiple sites and agents. It operated continuously rather than spectacularly, through mundane routines and procedures. It was productive rather than prohibitive, creating certain kinds of subjects rather than simply forbidding behaviors. Disciplinary power targeted individual bodies. It trained them through repetitive exercises, military drill, classroom lessons, factory routines, therapeutic regimens. It organized space to enable observation and control. It structured time to maximize productivity. It examined individuals to assess progress and correct deficiencies. Through these techniques, discipline transformed human material into efficient instruments. The prison exemplified this power in concentrated form, but the same techniques appeared everywhere. Schools disciplined children into students capable of sustained attention and regulated behavior. Hospitals disciplined patients into complying with medical regimens. Factories disciplined workers into performing repetitive tasks efficiently. The military disciplined recruits into soldiers who followed orders precisely. Disciplinary power produced both knowledge and control. By observing, measuring, and documenting individuals, institutions generated detailed knowledge of human behavior, capabilities, and development. This knowledge enabled more effective intervention. Psychology emerged from observing children in schools. Psychiatry emerged from observing madness in asylums. Criminology emerged from observing prisoners. Each discipline provided tools for normalizing its target population. But around the mid-18th century, another form of power began to emerge, biopower. This operated at a different scale than discipline. Where discipline targeted individual bodies, biopower targeted populations. Where discipline made individuals productive, biopower managed collective life processes. Biopower concerned itself with population-level phenomena, birth rates, death rates, longevity, fertility, health, disease, migration. These could not be addressed through individual discipline. They required statistical analysis and aggregate intervention. Governments began collecting demographic data, measuring population trends, implementing policies to influence these trends. Public health initiatives exemplified biopower. Vaccination campaigns aimed to prevent epidemics affecting entire populations. Sanitation projects reduced mortality rates across cities. Reproductive policies encouraged or discouraged births to optimize population size and quality. These interventions did not target specific individuals, but sought to regulate collective biological processes. Biopower operated through what Foucault called making live and letting die, inverting sovereign powers, taking life or letting live. The goal was not to kill enemies, but to optimize the life of populations. Those who fell outside norms of health, productivity, or reproduction might be left to die, excluded from care and resources. But the primary mechanism was fostering life deemed valuable. This created new political categories. Population was divided into groups based on biological characteristics: the healthy and the sick, the fertile and the sterile, the normal and the abnormal, the useful and the useless. Racism took new forms as populations were ranked biologically. Eugenics sought to improve population quality through selective breeding. These were applications of biopower's logic of optimization. Sexuality became a crucial site where biopower operated. Reproduction affected population size and quality. Sexual behavior influenced health through disease transmission. Family structure determined how children were raised. Therefore, sexuality had to be regulated not through moral prohibition, but through detailed knowledge and management. Medical experts, psychologists, and social workers intervened to normalize sexual behavior. Foucault emphasized that these three forms of power did not replace each other but layered and combined. Modern states still claim sovereign power, still execute criminals, still wage wars. Disciplinary institutions still train individual bodies. Biopower manages populations. All three operate simultaneously, often within the same institutions. Consider the prison. It exercises sovereign power by depriving individuals of liberty, a power derived from state sovereignty. It exercises disciplinary power through surveillance, schedules, and normalization of prisoners. And it participates in biopower by managing criminal populations, producing statistical knowledge about crime rates, and implementing policies to optimize public safety. Or consider schools. They exercise disciplinary power over individual students, training them through exams, schedules, and observation. But they also serve biopower by educating populations, reproducing skilled labor forces, and managing developmental norms across entire age cohorts. Educational policy operates at the population level, while classroom practice operates at the individual level. This analytical framework allowed Foucault to explain phenomena traditional political theory struggled to address. How could liberal democracies, committed to individual rights and limited government, exercise extensive control over populations? Because power operated not just through law and sovereignty, but through disciplines and biopower that seemed technical rather than political. How could humanitarian reforms like public health or universal education serve power? Because biopower operates precisely through fostering life, improving populations, and maximizing health. These genuinely improve lives while also normalizing populations and managing them more effectively. How could modern societies be simultaneously more free and more controlled than earlier societies? Because while sovereign power's explicit prohibitions decreased, disciplinary and biopower's continuous management increased. Less spectacular repression, but more total administration of life. This analysis had radical implications. It suggested that traditional political struggles focused on state power and legal rights missed much of how control operates. Winning legal equality or democratic representation would not eliminate disciplinary normalization in schools, hospitals, and workplaces. Ending state censorship would not eliminate subtle pressures to conform generated by continuous observation and examination. Resistance required attending to all forms of power. Fighting sovereign power meant contesting state authority and defending legal rights. Fighting disciplinary power meant resisting normalization, refusing to become docile, creating alternative institutions. Fighting biopower meant challenging population management, opposing eugenic logics, defending forms of life deemed abnormal or unproductive. Foucault's framework has proven enormously productive for analyzing contemporary phenomena. Mass incarceration can be understood as combining all three forms: sovereign power to imprison, disciplinary power to reform, biopower to manage criminal populations. Immigration control combines sovereign border authority, disciplinary processing of migrants, and biopolitical management of population flows. Public health responses to pandemics display all three: sovereign power to enforce quarantines, disciplinary power to regulate individual behavior, biopower to protect population health through vaccination and epidemiology. Each form operates through different mechanisms and raises different ethical and political questions. The framework also helps us understand emerging forms of power in digital surveillance capitalism. Tech platforms exercise a kind of sovereignty over their networks, setting rules and banning users. They implement disciplines through interface design that trains user behavior. And they operate biopolitically by analyzing population-level data to optimize engagement and profit. Understanding this evolution of power from execution to optimization reveals that political struggles today face a more complex field than traditional theory acknowledged. Power is not simply possessed by states or classes that can be overthrown. It operates through dispersed institutions and subtle mechanisms that are more difficult to contest, but also more vulnerable to localized resistance. Recognizing this multiplicity is essential for effective political action in modern societies. The dispositif, power's infrastructure. In his lectures and interviews during the 1970s, Foucault introduced a concept that would become central to his mature analysis of power: the dispositif. This French term is notoriously difficult to translate. English editions have used apparatus, device, or sometimes left it untranslated. But the concept itself is crucial for understanding how power actually operates in modern societies. A dispositif is a heterogeneous ensemble that includes institutions, architectural forms, regulations, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical propositions, moral commitments, and anything that can be said or done. What unites these disparate elements is that they respond to an urgent need, they serve a strategic function, and they form a system of relations. Consider sexuality as a dispositif. It includes medical institutions that diagnose and treat sexual disorders, psychiatric discourses that classify normal and abnormal desires, legal regulations that permit or prohibit certain sexual acts, architectural arrangements like the private bedroom, educational practices that teach children about their bodies, confessional techniques that require speaking sexual truth, popular culture that represents sexuality in specific ways. All these elements form a system oriented toward managing sexual behavior. Or consider security as a dispositif. It includes police forces and surveillance technologies, laws defining crimes and terrorism, architecture designed for monitoring public spaces, statistical knowledge of crime rates and risk factors, media discourses about threats and dangers, insurance practices that assess and distribute risk, military institutions and intelligence agencies, border controls and identification systems. These heterogeneous elements combine to form an apparatus for managing security. The dispositif concept captures several important features of modern power. First, power does not reside in a single location or institution. It operates through networks that connect multiple sites. The prison is not an isolated institution, but part of a larger dispositif that includes police, courts, social services, psychiatric hospitals, schools, and families. These institutions pass individuals among themselves, each intervening to normalize behavior. Second, power operates through both discursive and non-discursive elements. Discourses matter. How we talk about crime, madness, sexuality, health shapes how we understand and respond to these phenomena. But architecture matters too, as does technology, institutional organization, and administrative procedure. Power works through material arrangements, not just ideas or language. Third, the dispositif responds to historical urgencies. It emerges to address specific problems that a society faces. The security dispositif intensified after September 11, 2001, responding to perceived terrorist threats. The public health dispositif expanded during the COVID-19 pandemic, responding to disease spread. Each crisis triggers elaboration of relevant dispositifs. Fourth, the dispositif includes both intentional and unintentional effects. Actors design elements to achieve certain goals. Bentham designed the Panopticon to produce discipline. But the overall effects of a dispositif exceed any single intention. No one planned the entire carceral system, yet it emerged from interactions among multiple institutions pursuing different goals. Fifth, the dispositif is strategic but lacks a strategist. It serves functions, produces effects, and responds to problems. But no central authority controls it. Multiple actors contribute. Legislators pass laws, architects design buildings, doctors develop treatments, police enforce rules, media shape opinion. Their actions combine to form a system, but no one directs the whole system. This concept challenged traditional theories of power that focused on the state or ruling class. The dispositif shows power as relational and dispersed rather than possessed and concentrated. Power flows through networks connecting multiple actors and institutions. Changing one element affects others, but no single intervention can dismantle the entire apparatus. Foucault used the dispositif concept to analyze specific historical formations. The disciplinary dispositif emerged in the 18th century, connecting schools, hospitals, prisons, factories, and barracks through shared techniques. The security dispositif developed later, integrating police, statistics, urban planning, and social insurance to manage populations. The sexuality dispositif organized knowledge and intervention around sexual behavior from the 19th century onward. Each dispositif includes what Foucault called regimes of truth, systems that determine what counts as true or false in a particular domain. Medical discourse establishes truth about health and disease. Psychiatric discourse establishes truth about sanity and madness. Economic discourse establishes truth about value and efficiency. These truths are not simply discovered but produced through institutional practices, scientific procedures, and expert authority. The dispositif also produces subjects. It does not just control pre-existing individuals but shapes how people understand and conduct themselves. The medical dispositif produces patients who think of themselves as having diseases requiring expert treatment. The educational dispositif produces students who understand themselves as needing training and certification. The security dispositif produces citizens who accept surveillance as necessary for safety. This subject production occurs through what Foucault called subjectivation. Individuals are subjected to power, made into subjects of institutional knowledge and control, but they also become subjects in the sense of agents who actively relate to themselves and others. These processes are simultaneous. Being made into a patient involves learning to monitor symptoms, follow treatments, and identify as someone with a medical condition. Contemporary examples illustrate how dispositives function. Consider the smartphone as part of multiple dispositives. It connects to security apparatus through location tracking and data collection. It participates in commercial dispositives through advertising and consumer surveillance. It enables social dispositives through communication platforms. It contributes to governmental dispositives through digital identification and services. The device itself is not the dispositif, but it becomes a node connecting multiple systems of power and knowledge. Or consider credit scores. This numerical rating emerges from a dispositif that includes financial institutions, credit bureaus, statistical algorithms, legal regulations, employment screening, housing markets, and consumer behavior. The score shapes access to loans, housing, jobs, and services. It encourages certain behaviors like paying bills on time and discourages others like defaulting on debt. It produces subjects who monitor their creditworthiness and manage their financial identity. The environmental dispositif provides another example. It includes scientific institutions producing climate data, international organizations negotiating emissions targets, national governments implementing environmental regulations, corporations developing green technologies, activist movements demanding action, media reporting environmental threats, educational programs teaching sustainability, and individual practices like recycling. These elements form a complex apparatus responding to ecological crisis. Understanding power as dispositif has several implications for resistance. First, since power operates through networks rather than centralized control, resistance must also be networked and multiple. Challenging one institution or law is insufficient. Effective resistance requires intervening at multiple points where the dispositif operates. Second, since dispositifs include both discursive and material elements, resistance must address both. Changing how we talk about mental health matters, but so does changing psychiatric institutions, pharmaceutical practices, and insurance coverage. Counter-discourse alone cannot transform a dispositif. Third, since dispositifs produce subjects, resistance involves creating new forms of subjectivity. People must refuse identities imposed by power and experiment with alternative ways of being. This is not just ideological struggle, but practical work of self-transformation. Fourth, since dispositifs emerge to address real problems, resistance cannot simply oppose them without offering alternatives. The security dispositif responds to genuine concerns about violence and safety. The health dispositif addresses real suffering from disease. Effective resistance must acknowledge these concerns while proposing different solutions. Foucault emphasized that dispositifs are never total or complete. They contain internal tensions and contradictions. They produce resistances even as they seek control. The security dispositif creates categories of dangerous populations, but those populations organize against their stigmatization. The medical dispositif establishes expertise, but patients develop their own knowledge and challenge medical authority. Moreover, dispositifs are always transforming. New elements are added, old elements become obsolete, relationships shift. Digital technologies have transformed the surveillance dispositif. Genomics is transforming the medical dispositif. Climate change is forcing transformation of energy and agricultural dispositifs. These transformations create opportunities for intervention and redirection. The dispositif concept also helps explain why reforms often have unintended consequences. When one element of a dispositif changes, others adjust to maintain the system's overall function. Prison reform might reduce incarceration but lead to increased electronic monitoring. The institutionalization of mental patients might reduce hospitalization but increase homelessness and imprisonment. The dispositif adapts, routing power through different channels. This suggests that effective transformation requires addressing the dispositif as a system rather than isolated elements. Prison abolition, for example, cannot simply close prisons. It must address the entire carceral dispositif. Police practices, court procedures, social services, employment discrimination, housing access, drug policies, and public attitudes toward punishment. Only systemic intervention can prevent the system from reconstituting itself through new mechanisms. Researchers across disciplines have adopted the dispositif concept to analyze contemporary phenomena. Scholars study the migration dispositif connecting border enforcement, detention centers, legal status categories, labor markets, and xenophobic discourse. The obesity dispositif linking medical definitions, dietary industries, fitness culture, body image standards, and public health interventions. The terrorist dispositif combining security measures, racialized surveillance, emergency powers, and political rhetoric. In each case, the concept reveals how power operates through heterogeneous assemblages rather than centralized command. It shows how institutions, discourses, technologies, and practices combine to govern conduct, and it indicates where interventions might disrupt these assemblages and open possibilities for alternative arrangements. The dispositif remains one of Foucault's most useful analytical tools. It provides a framework for mapping how power actually operates in complex modern societies. It reveals connections between apparently separate institutions and practices. It explains how control is exercised without centralized authority, and it suggests strategies for resistance that address power's infrastructure rather than just its surface manifestations. Knowledge power, how truth becomes control. One of Foucault's most important and controversial claims was that knowledge and power are inseparable. This connection is often abbreviated as knowledge power or power knowledge, suggesting an internal relationship rather than two separate entities that sometimes interact. Understanding this relationship is essential for grasping Foucault's entire project. Traditional philosophy assumed that knowledge and power were distinct and opposed. Knowledge was objective, disinterested, and universal. Power was subjective, interested, and particular. True knowledge required independence from power. Scientists should pursue truth without political influence. Philosophers should reason without regard to practical consequences. The ideal was pure knowledge untainted by power. Foucault argued this ideal was not only impossible but misleading. Knowledge and power are not opposites but constitute each other. Every form of knowledge enables certain forms of power. Every exercise of power produces certain forms of knowledge. They are two sides of a single process. Consider medicine. Medical knowledge claims to be objective science, discovered through neutral observation and experiment. But Foucault showed that medical knowledge emerged from institutional practices of examining patients in clinics and hospitals. These institutions gave doctors power over patients, power to examine bodies, diagnose diseases, prescribe treatments, confine the sick. This power enabled the production of medical knowledge through systematic observation of many cases. Conversely, medical knowledge enabled new forms of power. Once diseases could be diagnosed and classified, populations could be screened and managed. Public health authorities could quarantine the infected, mandate vaccinations, regulate sanitation. Medical expertise authorized intervention in private life, how people ate, slept, raised children, conducted sexual relations. Knowledge enabled power over previously autonomous domains. The examination exemplified this knowledge-power relationship. Whether medical exam, school test, or psychiatric assessment, examination subjected individuals to observation and judgment. It made them into objects of knowledge, cases to be classified, documented, analyzed. But this knowledge production was also power exercise. The exam determined who passed or failed, who was normal or abnormal, who received treatment or punishment. Through examination, individuals became simultaneously known and controlled. Their capacities were measured, their deficiencies identified, their progress tracked. Files accumulated information that followed them through institutions. This information authorized intervention, additional training for slow learners, therapy for the mentally ill, supervision for deviants. Knowledge of individuals enabled their management. Foucault called this process normalization. Knowledge established norms, standards of health, intelligence, behavior, development. Individuals were measured against these norms and ranked accordingly. Those below norms required correction through additional discipline, treatment, or training. Those above norms were models for others. Normalization was both knowledge operation, establishing what is normal, and power operation, enforcing conformity. The human sciences embodied this knowledge-power nexus. Psychology emerged from observing children in schools, patients in asylums, workers in factories. It claimed to discover universal laws of human behavior, but it produced knowledge through institutional practices that already exercised power over subjects, and psychological knowledge authorized new interventions, testing students, treating neuroses, managing personnel. Sociology similarly emerged from studying populations in cities, factories, and institutions. It claimed objective knowledge of social laws, but it developed through statistical techniques that governments used to manage populations. Sociological knowledge enabled social engineering, urban planning, welfare administration, labor management. The knowledge served governmental rationality. Criminology exemplified the process most clearly. It emerged from observing prisoners, producing theories about criminal types and causes of crime. This knowledge authorized intervention, classification systems, treatment programs, parole decisions, but criminology also helped construct its own object. By defining criminal types, it created categories into which individuals were sorted. By identifying causes, it suggested interventions that shaped criminal identities. Foucault argued that this knowledge-power relationship operated in domains beyond the human sciences. Even natural sciences involved power relations, though differently. The laboratory established hierarchies between experimenters and assistants, between scientists and laypeople. Scientific authority determined whose observations counted as evidence, whose theories deserved funding, what questions were worth investigating. Moreover, scientific knowledge enabled technological power, engineering, medicine, weapons, surveillance systems. The relationship between physics and military technology, chemistry and industrial production, biology and pharmaceutical medicine showed how scientific knowledge was inseparable from power over nature and humans. The dream of pure science isolated from politics was ideology obscuring these connections. This analysis did not mean all knowledge claims were equally valid or that truth did not exist. Foucault insisted he was not a relativist. Some theories were better supported by evidence than others. Some methods were more reliable. Medical treatments could be effective or ineffective. His point was different, that even valid knowledge emerged from power relations and enabled power's exercise. The question was not whether knowledge was true or false in absolute terms, but how truth was produced and what effects it had. What institutional practices enabled certain statements to count as true? What forms of authority determined truth? What could be done with knowledge once established as true? These questions shifted analysis from epistemology to politics. Foucault identified regimes of truth, systems that determined what counted as true in particular domains at particular times. Each regime included rules for distinguishing true from false statements, procedures for validating claims, institutions authorized to establish truth, and techniques for producing knowledge. Science was one regime of truth, but not the only one. Law, religion, and common sense had their own regimes. These regimes were historical and changeable. What counted as valid medical knowledge in 1800 differed from 1900 or 2000. Not because earlier doctors were stupid, but because the entire regime of medical truth transformed. What questions were asked, what observations counted as relevant, what explanatory frameworks were acceptable, what institutions validated knowledge. Power operated through regimes of truth by making certain statements possible and excluding others. In Renaissance medicine, disease could be explained through humoral imbalances. In modern medicine, this explanation became impossible within the regime of truth. Not because humors were disproven, but because the entire framework of what counted as medical explanation changed. This meant that contesting power required challenging regimes of truth, not just arguing within them. If psychiatric discourse defined homosexuality as mental illness, arguing that homosexuality should be accepted became difficult within that regime. The discourse itself, which made homosexuality an object of psychiatric knowledge, had to be challenged. This required showing how that knowledge was produced and what power relations it served. Gay liberation movements in the 1970s accomplished this. They did not primarily argue that psychiatry's claims were false. They challenged psychiatry's authority to define sexual normality. They produced alternative knowledges through activism, personal testimony, and community organization. They created new truth games where sexual diversity was natural rather than pathological. This was political struggle at the level of knowledge itself. Feminist movements similarly challenged regimes of truth about gender. Scientific claims about natural differences between men and women had authorized discrimination and exclusion. Feminists showed how this knowledge was produced through gendered institutions and male-dominated research. They developed alternative knowledges through women's studies, feminist science, and experiential authority. This transformed not just politics but knowledge itself. These examples illustrated Foucault's point that resistance must involve knowledge production. Oppressed groups cannot simply appeal to pre-existing truths. They must create new truths, challenge existing authorities, establish alternative regimes of knowledge. This is why subjugated knowledges matter. The knowledge of prisoners, patients, workers, colonized peoples, sexual minorities. These knowledges were excluded by dominant regimes but contained critical perspectives on power. The knowledge-power relationship also explained why expertise was political. Experts claimed authority based on specialized knowledge: doctors over health, teachers over education, economists over the economy, psychologists over behavior. This authority enabled intervention in people's lives presented as technical rather than political. But technical decisions were always political because they involved power over others. Modern government increasingly operated through expertise. Instead of explicit command, states governed through expert knowledge, economic statistics, public health data, educational standards, risk assessments. This governmental rationality presented itself as neutral administration of problems, but it involved constant exercise of power, defining problems, establishing norms, classifying populations, intervening to optimize outcomes. Neoliberalism exemplified this. It presented itself as technical economic science rather than political ideology. Neoliberal economists claimed to discover natural laws of markets requiring specific policies. But Foucault showed that neoliberalism was a political rationality that reorganized society according to market principles. Its knowledge authorized dismantling welfare states, privatizing public services, and subordinating all domains to economic calculation. Understanding knowledge power has practical implications. It suggests skepticism toward claims that policies are merely technical necessities discovered by experts. It requires asking what power relations produce expert knowledge and what power that knowledge enables. It demands examining whose interests are served by what counts as true. But it does not mean rejecting all expertise or embracing conspiracy theories. Foucault distinguished between showing that knowledge involves power relations and claiming that knowledge is nothing but ideology. The fact that medical knowledge emerged from power-laden institutions does not make medicine useless. It means we should examine how medical authority is established and what effects it produces. The challenge is to maintain critical distance from regimes of truth while recognizing that we cannot escape them entirely. We must use existing knowledges while questioning how they were produced. We must respect expertise while challenging its claims to be beyond politics. We must produce new knowledges while acknowledging they will also involve power relations. This critical stance toward knowledge power remains essential for contemporary politics. In an age where algorithms claim to discover objective truths about human behavior, where neuroscience claims to explain consciousness, where economics claims to predict social outcomes, Foucault's analysis reminds us that all knowledge emerges from power relations and serves political functions. Recognizing this does not eliminate knowledge, but transforms how we engage with truth claims and expert authority. The repressive hypothesis debunked. In 1976, Foucault published the first volume of The History of Sexuality. The book opened with a provocative challenge to what Foucault called the repressive hypothesis, the widespread belief that modern societies, especially Victorian society, repress sexuality through silence, prohibition, and denial. According to this hypothesis, sexuality was natural and free until the rise of capitalism and the bourgeoisie. The Victorian era then imposed repression. Sex became taboo, people stopped talking about it, desires were suppressed. This repression served capitalist interests by channeling energy into productive labor. Only in the 20th century did liberation movements begin freeing sexuality from repressive constraints. This narrative was common across the political spectrum. Conservatives agreed that Victorians repressed sexuality, though they saw this as necessary moral restraint. Progressives agreed but saw it as harmful suppression requiring liberation. Marxists agreed, analyzing repression as serving capitalist accumulation. Freudians agreed, making repression central to psychoanalytic theory. The disagreement was whether repression was good or bad, not whether it occurred. Foucault argued the entire hypothesis was wrong. Victorian society did not repress sexuality through silence. It produced an explosion of discourse about sexuality. People talked about sex constantly, in medical texts, psychiatric case studies, pastoral manuals, educational treatises, popular novels, legal proceedings. The Victorian era was obsessed with sex, generating endless speech about it. Moreover, this discourse did not simply describe pre-existing sexuality. It produced sexuality as an object of knowledge and domain of intervention. Before the 19th century, there were sexual acts, pleasures, relationships, but sexuality as a unified domain requiring expert knowledge did not exist. The Victorian era created it through its obsessive need to speak about sexual truth. This began with Christian confession. For centuries, the Church required believers to confess sexual thoughts and acts in detail. What had you desired? With whom? How? When? In what positions? This technique, originally religious, was secularized and intensified in modernity. Sexuality became something that must be constantly examined and spoken about. Medicine took up this imperative. Doctors began studying sexual development, cataloging sexual practices, identifying sexual pathologies. They created elaborate taxonomies of perversions, fetishism, exhibitionism, sadism, masochism, homosexuality, and countless variations. Each category became an object of medical investigation requiring clinical description and treatment. Psychiatry made sexuality central to mental health. Sexual behavior supposedly revealed underlying psychological states. Sexual desires indicated personality types. Sexual development determined adult character. Psychiatrists interrogated patients about their sexual histories, treating this information as key to diagnosis and cure. Sex was made essential to identity. Pedagogy focused intensely on childhood sexuality. Educators worried constantly about masturbation, which was blamed for physical and moral degeneration. Schools organized surveillance of children's bodies, bathrooms, dormitories. Parents were taught to monitor their children's sexual behavior. An entire apparatus developed around managing childhood sexuality through observation and intervention. Demography made sexuality a matter of state concern. Population size affected national strength. Birth rates required management. Reproductive health became public health. Governments collected statistics on marriage, births, and deaths. They implemented policies to encourage reproduction among desired populations and discourage it among others. Sex was politicized through population management. Foucault identified 4 strategic unities in the 19th century deployment of sexuality. First, the historization of women's bodies. Female sexuality was medicalized as inherently pathological. Women's bodies were saturated with sexuality, yet women were supposed to be naturally modest. This contradiction required medical intervention to manage women's dangerous sexual nature. Second, the pedagogization of children's sex. Childhood sexuality was simultaneously denied and obsessively monitored. Children were seen as innocent yet vulnerable to sexual corruption. This paradox justified constant surveillance by parents, teachers, and doctors. The child's body became a target of sexual knowledge and control. Third, the socialization of procreative behavior. Reproduction became a social responsibility. Couples were encouraged or discouraged from having children based on economic status, health, and race. Techniques were developed to manage fertility, contraception for some, encouragement for others. Procreation was subjected to social regulation. Fourth, the psychiatrization of perverse pleasure. Any sexual practice not oriented toward marital reproduction was classified as perversion. Homosexuality, which had been simply one act among others, became an identity, a type of person. The pervert emerged as a distinct figure requiring psychiatric knowledge and possible cure or control. These strategies did not repress sexuality but proliferated it. They created new categories, identities, and objects of knowledge. They produced subjects who understood themselves primarily through their sexuality. They authorized endless intervention into private life. Far from silencing sex, they made everyone speak it constantly. The repressive hypothesis, Foucault argued, served this proliferation. By claiming that sex was repressed, modern societies justified talking about it endlessly. Speaking sex became transgressive, liberating, politically progressive. But this very speech was how power operated. Getting people to constantly speak sexual truth was precisely how sexuality was deployed as a mechanism of control. Psychoanalysis exemplified this dynamic. It presented itself as liberating sexuality from repression by encouraging patients to speak freely about desires. But this free speech occurred in a clinical setting under expert interpretation. The analyst, not the patient, determined what the confessions really meant. Speaking sexual truth became a therapeutic obligation, a technique for producing normalized subjects. The sexual liberation movements of the 1960s and 1970s similarly remained within the deployment of sexuality. They challenged specific prohibitions and repressions, but they intensified the imperative to speak sex, to make it central to identity, to seek sexual truth. Gay liberation, for example, opposed psychiatry's pathologization of homosexuality, but often reinforced the idea that sexual orientation was the core of identity. Foucault did not deny that specific prohibitions existed or that they caused suffering. Victorian morality did forbid many sexual expressions. Homosexuals faced persecution. Women's sexuality was constrained. But these prohibitions were part of a larger apparatus that was fundamentally productive rather than repressive. The apparatus produced sexual identities, sexual knowledges, and sexual subjects. This analysis was controversial. Many activists felt Foucault was minimizing real oppression. If sexuality was not repressed, what were they fighting against? But Foucault's point was strategic. Understanding power correctly was essential for effective resistance. If power operates through proliferating discourse rather than imposing silence, then liberation requires different tactics than simply speaking freely. The analysis also challenged the assumption that sexuality was a natural drive that society represses. Foucault argued that sexuality itself was a historical construct, not sexual acts or pleasures which have always existed, but sexuality as a unified domain with essential truth about identity. This construct emerged from specific practices: confession, medical examination, psychiatric classification, pedagogical surveillance. This meant that sexual liberation could not consist of simply removing repression to let natural sexuality flourish. There was no natural sexuality beneath social construction. Different historical periods and cultures organized sexual experience in fundamentally different ways. Ancient Greeks did not have sexual orientation as we understand it. They organized sexual experience around active and passive roles, not homosexual and heterosexual identities. If sexuality is historical rather than natural, it can be transformed. The goal is not to discover true sexuality beneath repression, but to create new possibilities for pleasure, relationship, and identity. This requires experimenting with different ways of organizing sexual experience, refusing categories imposed by medical and psychiatric discourse, and developing alternative knowledges based on lived experience. Foucault's analysis of the repressive hypothesis remains relevant as contemporary societies continue to proliferate discourse about sexuality. Sex education expands in schools. Media represents sexuality constantly. Self-help literature teaches sexual techniques. Therapy addresses sexual dysfunctions. Dating apps quantify sexual markets. Online pornography is ubiquitous. Far from silence, we have never spoken more about sex. Yet this proliferation does not necessarily produce liberation. Much contemporary sexual discourse remains within the deployment of sexuality, making sex essential to identity, seeking authentic sexual truth, submitting desires to expert interpretation. The imperative to speak sex, to perform it correctly, to optimize sexual satisfaction, can itself become oppressive. Understanding this helps us think critically about contemporary sexual politics. Debates about sexual freedom often assume the repressive hypothesis: more speech equals more liberation. But if power operates through proliferating discourse, simply speaking more freely may not resist power. What matters is how speech is organized, who interprets it, what effects it produces. This does not mean silence is preferable. Foucault's point was not that we should stop talking about sex, but that we should recognize how our ways of speaking serve power. Confession makes us constantly examine and report our desires. Classification makes us identify with sexual categories. Expertise makes us seek external validation for our experiences. These techniques operate through speech, not silence. Resisting requires creating different ways of relating to sexuality, refusing imposed identities, experimenting with pleasures outside expert frameworks, developing communities that validate diverse experiences without requiring confession or classification. This is what Foucault would later call an aesthetics of existence, creating oneself according to self-chosen principles rather than normalized categories. The repressive hypothesis, once debunked, reveals a more complex field of sexual politics. Power does not simply prohibit, but produces. Liberation does not consist of removing restraints, but of creating new possibilities. And sexuality itself is not a natural constant, but a historical field open to transformation. These insights remain essential for thinking about sex, power, and freedom today. Scientia Sexualis, making sex a science. Having challenged the repressive hypothesis, Foucault turned to explaining how modern Western societies actually organize sexual experience. He contrasted two historical approaches to sexual truth, ars erotica and scientia sexualis. This distinction revealed what was unique and strange about the modern Western approach to sexuality. Many societies throughout history developed an ars erotica, an erotic art. In these traditions, sexual pleasure itself was the source of truth and knowledge. Practitioners cultivated refined techniques for maximizing pleasure. Masters transmitted secret knowledge to initiates. The goal was to intensify experience, prolong enjoyment, and achieve transcendent states through sexual practice. Ancient Chinese Taoist sexual practices exemplified this approach. Practitioners learned techniques to circulate vital energy during sex, prolonging intercourse without ejaculation, balancing yin and yang forces. The knowledge was esoteric, passed through lineages of masters. Sexual pleasure was valued for its own sake and for its connection to health, longevity, and spiritual development. Japanese erotic traditions similarly emphasized cultivation of pleasure through technique. The Kama Sutra in India catalogued positions and practices for enhancing enjoyment. Islamic societies developed erotic literatures that celebrated sexual pleasure while integrating it with religious and ethical frameworks. In each case, knowledge about sex emerged from the experience of pleasure refined through practice. These traditions did not ignore reproduction or morality, but they did not subordinate sexual pleasure to these concerns. Sex was understood as an art requiring learning and practice, like music or calligraphy. The pleasure itself contained truth about bodies, relationships, the nature of existence. This truth was discovered through direct experience rather than extracted through confession or observation. Western Christianity took a completely different path. It developed what Foucault called scientia sexualis, a science of sexuality. Instead of cultivating pleasure, the West organized sexuality around extracting truth through discourse. Sexual truth was not in the act itself, but in what could be said about desire, its origins, its meanings, its effects. This began with the Christian practice of confession. Medieval penitential manuals required confessing sexual thoughts and acts in minute detail. The priest interrogated the penitent. What did you think? What did you do? With whom? How many times? In what manner? Every detail had to be spoken. The truth of sin lay not in the act, but in the confession of the act. Confession established several principles that would persist into modernity. First, sexual truth must be extracted through speech. The act itself was insufficient. One had to speak it, analyze it, interpret it. Second, this speech required an authority to hear and interpret. The penitent could not determine their own truth. The priest judged what the confession revealed. Third, speaking sexual truth was obligatory. Confession was not voluntary disclosure but required practice. Failure to confess completely was itself a sin. Fourth, sexual thoughts mattered as much as acts. Desires, fantasies, and temptations all required confession. Inner life became subject to scrutiny and speech. Fifth, speaking sex was linked to salvation. Confessing sexual truth was necessary for spiritual progress. The soul's relationship to God depended on exhaustively examining and reporting sexual experience. This made sexuality central to identity and salvation in ways unprecedented in other traditions. These principles were secularized in modernity but not abandoned. Medicine, psychiatry, education, and law all inherited the confessional imperative. They transformed religious confession into secular techniques for extracting sexual truth. But the basic structure remained. Sexuality contains essential truth that must be spoken, interpreted by experts, and used to constitute and govern subjects. Medicine made sex a matter of health rather than sin. Doctors questioned patients about sexual behavior, frequency, partners, practices, satisfactions. They compiled case studies documenting sexual variations. They identified pathologies requiring treatment. Medical discourse positioned doctors as authorities who could interpret sexual truth for health purposes. The medicalization of sexuality created new categories and concerns. Normal sexual development became an object of study. Deviations from norms required explanation and potentially intervention. Sexual dysfunction became a medical problem. Reproduction was subjected to medical management. Sex moved from moral to medical discourse but remained thoroughly problematized. Psychiatry intensified this process. Freud made sexuality absolutely central to psychoanalysis. He insisted that sexual experiences, especially in childhood, determined psychological development. Neuroses were traced to sexual repression or trauma. Analysis required exhaustively recounting sexual history. The analyst interpreted what this history revealed about the unconscious. Psychoanalysis presented itself as liberating patients from sexual repression. But Foucault showed it was actually extending scientia sexualis. It required speaking sexual truth in even greater detail than confession. It subordinated the speaker's understanding to expert interpretation. It made sexuality the key to identity and mental health. It was confessional practice adapted to modern therapeutic context. Education made childhood sexuality an object of constant attention. Educators worried about masturbation, homosexual experimentation, precocious sexuality. They developed techniques for surveillance and intervention. Sex education taught children to understand their bodies through medical and moral frameworks. Childhood became saturated with concerns about sexual development and deviation. Demography and statistics made sexuality a matter of population management. Governments collected data on birth rates, marriage ages, family size. They analyzed how sexual behavior affected population growth, health, and quality. This created new imperatives to intervene in reproductive behavior through policy and education. Law regulated sexuality through detailed prohibitions and permissions. It defined legitimate and illegitimate sexual acts, partners, contexts. Legal proceedings required testimony about sexual behavior. Courts determined sexual truth in cases of rape, sodomy, adultery, indecency. Legal discourse produced elaborate definitions of sexual crimes and deviance. All these discourses shared the confessional structure. They required speaking sexual truth. They positioned experts as interpreters. They made sexuality essential to identity. They authorized intervention based on expert knowledge. Together they formed Scientia Sexualis, an apparatus for producing sexual truth through discourse rather than pleasure. Foucault identified several effects of this apparatus. First, it created the modern individual as a sexual subject. People came to understand themselves primarily through their sexuality. Sexual orientation became a core identity. Sexual satisfaction became essential to well-being. Sexual truth revealed one's authentic self. Second, it produced sexual identities and categories that had not previously existed. The homosexual emerged as a distinct type of person, not just someone who performed certain acts. The heterosexual was invented as the normal counterpart. Countless perversions were catalogued and classified. Each category became an identity that individuals could or must inhabit. Third, it authorized extensive intervention into private life. Because sexuality contained essential truth and affected health, development, and social order, experts claimed authority to observe, judge, and regulate sexual behavior. What had been private became subject to institutional management. Fourth, it made speaking sex imperative. Silence about sexuality became suspicious. Refusing to speak suggested repression, denial, or pathology. Modern subjects were obligated to constantly examine and articulate their desires. This extended confessional power while appearing to liberate. Fifth, it subordinated pleasure to meaning. The erotic arts valued sexual experience for its own sake. Scientia Sexualis valued sexual experience for what it revealed about identity, psychology, development, health. Pleasure became secondary to interpretation. One had to understand what desires meant rather than simply enjoy them. Foucault suggested that psychoanalysis represented both the culmination and potential undoing of Scientia Sexualis. It perfected the confessional technique, requiring exhaustive speech about desire under expert interpretation. But it also suggested that the search for sexual truth might be endless, that desire might resist final interpretation, that the supposed truth might be an illusion produced by the search itself. This analysis explained why sexual liberation movements often failed to escape the deployment of sexuality. They challenged specific prohibitions and stigmas, but they intensified the confessional imperative, the centrality of sexual identity, and the search for authentic sexual truth. Coming out required confessing sexual orientation. Sexual freedom meant expressing true desires. Liberation required recognizing sexuality as essential to self. Foucault was not condemning these movements. They achieved important gains and reduced genuine suffering. But he suggested that liberation could not consist simply of speaking sexual truth more freely. The apparatus that made sexuality central to truth and identity itself needed questioning. This meant developing different relationships to desire, pleasure, and identity. Later, Foucault would explore ancient alternatives to Scientia Sexualis. Greek and Roman sexual ethics did not make sexuality a domain of truth or center of identity. Sexual acts were ethically significant, but not revelatory of essential self. This historical comparison showed that modern Western approaches were not universal or inevitable. Understanding Scientia Sexualis helps us analyze contemporary sexual culture. The proliferation of sexual discourse continues. Dating apps that categorize desires, pornography that depicts variations, therapy that addresses sexual issues, education that teaches techniques, media that discusses sex constantly. We are obligated to know our sexualities, express them, optimize them. Self-help books promise to reveal sexual truth and achieve satisfaction. Online communities organize around sexual identities. Medical interventions address sexual dysfunctions. All assume that sexuality is an essential domain containing truth about who we are. All require speaking, analyzing, and interpreting sexual experience. All position experts as necessary for achieving sexual health and satisfaction. This does not mean we should return to silence or repression. Foucault's point was that the choice is not between repressive silence and liberating speech. The question is what kind of relationship to desire and pleasure we want to cultivate. Might we value pleasure for its own sake rather than for what it supposedly reveals? Might we refuse sexual categories as exhaustive descriptions of experience? Might we experiment with relationships and practices outside expert frameworks? These questions suggest alternatives to both repression and confession. They point toward what Foucault would later call an aesthetics of existence, creating oneself according to self-chosen principles rather than submitted to imposed truths. This requires neither silence nor endless speech, but a different way of relating to desire that refuses to make sexuality the master key to identity. The confession apparatus, from sin to psychology. Confession stands at the heart of Western approaches to sexuality and subjectivity. Foucault traced how this originally Christian practice became a pervasive secular technique for producing truth about individuals. Understanding this transformation reveals how modern power operates through requiring subjects to speak their own truth. In medieval Christianity, confession was one of 7 sacraments. Believers were obligated to confess sins regularly to priests. This was not optional disclosure, but religious duty. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated annual confession for all Christians. Failure to confess was itself a serious sin requiring confession. Early confession focused primarily on acts. What had you done? The penitent listed transgressions against commandments, but confession gradually became more demanding. It required examining intentions, thoughts, desires. Not just what you did, but what you wanted to do. Not just actions, but the movements of the soul towards sin. This intensified in the Counter-Reformation. The Council of Trent in the 16th century required confessing all mortal sins with their circumstances. Jesuit manuals instructed confessors to interrogate penitents thoroughly. How often? In what manner? With whom? What pleasure? Questions multiplied. Confession became exhaustive examination of inner life. Sexual sins received special attention. Desires, thoughts, and acts all required detailed description. Confessor manuals spent hundreds of pages on sexual casuistry. What acts were permissible in marriage, what positions were sinful, how to question about unusual practices. An entire discourse about sexuality was produced through confessional interrogation. Confession established several principles that would persist. First, truth resides in hidden interiority that must be externalized through speech. Acts alone do not reveal truth. One must speak thoughts, desires, intentions. Inner life becomes the locus of truth. Second, this truth cannot be self-evident. The speaker needs an interpreter. The priest does not simply record confession, but interprets what it reveals about the penitent's spiritual state. The authority determines what the confession actually means. Third, speaking is mandatory, not voluntary. The obligation to confess overrides any preference for silence. Remaining silent suggests hiding sin, which aggravates guilt. Confession is extracted as duty rather than freely given. Fourth, the confession scene involves power asymmetry. The priest has authority to hear, judge, and impose penance. The penitent submits to this authority, accepting the priest's interpretation and prescription. The power relation is built into the confessional structure. Fifth, confession is linked to transformation. Speaking sin is necessary for absolution and spiritual progress. The soul must be purified through verbal externalization of interior corruption. Speech itself has redemptive power when performed in proper confessional context. Christianity made confession central to Western subjectivity in unprecedented ways. Ancient Greeks had practices of self-examination, but these were voluntary exercises for cultivating virtue. Buddhist traditions had confession, but it did not require the exhaustive interiority or authoritative interpretation that Christianity developed. Christianity made confession obligatory, total, and interpretive in ways that would shape Western culture permanently. Beginning in the 18th century, confession was secularized. The structure remained but moved into new domains. Medicine adopted confessional techniques. Doctors questioned patients about symptoms, habits, family histories. Medical examination combined physical observation with verbal interrogation. Patients confessed bodily experiences for medical interpretation. Medical confession focused especially on sexuality and reproduction. Women confessed menstrual cycles, pregnancies, sexual relations. Men confessed venereal diseases, impotence, nocturnal emissions. Children confessed masturbation. This medical confession produced knowledge about sexual norms and pathologies while authorizing medical intervention in sexual life. Psychiatry intensified confessional practice. The psychiatric interview required patients to speak their histories, symptoms, dreams, desires. Psychiatrists probed for hidden memories, repressed traumas, unconscious wishes. The patient's speech was primary data that psychiatrists interpreted to diagnose and treat mental illness. Psychoanalysis perfected the confessional technique. Free association required saying everything that came to mind without censorship. Dreams had to be recounted and analyzed. Childhood memories required exhaustive excavation. The analysis lasted years, hundreds of hours devoted to confessional speech interpreted by the analyst. Freud theorized that speaking repressed material had therapeutic effects. Making the unconscious conscious through verbal articulation would cure neuroses. But Foucault noted this reproduced confessional logic. Hidden interior truth must be externalized through speech to authoritative interpreter for transformation to occur. Education adopted confessional practices. Teachers questioned students about their activities, interests, difficulties. School counselors conducted interviews exploring personal problems. Students wrote autobiographical essays. Progressive education emphasized self-expression, requiring students to articulate their feelings and experiences for pedagogical purposes. Criminal justice employed confession extensively. Police interrogated suspects to obtain confessions. Trials featured confessional testimony. Sentencing considered whether defendants expressed remorse, a form of confession. Parole required confessing rehabilitation. Confession remained central to criminal justice despite legal protections against self-incrimination. Social work and welfare administration required confessing personal circumstances. To receive assistance, individuals had to disclose income, family situation, health problems, housing conditions. Social workers interviewed clients, producing case files that documented their lives. Access to benefits depended on adequate confession. Therapy culture expanded confessional practices dramatically. Counseling, therapy, support groups all centered on confessional speech. Individuals confessed problems to therapists who interpreted underlying issues. Self-help required examining and articulating one's feelings, traumas, desires. Television talk shows broadcast confessions to mass audiences. Reality TV made confession entertainment. The confessional apparatus spread into everyday life. Job interviews required confessing qualifications, motivations, weaknesses. Dating involved confessing preferences, histories, intentions. Social media enabled constant confession of thoughts, activities, opinions. Algorithms encouraged sharing personal information. Digital culture made confession ubiquitous and apparently voluntary. Foucault identified several effects of this apparatus. First, Western subjects learned to experience themselves as containing hidden depths requiring speech. The self became something with secret truth accessible only through confessional articulation. This experience seems natural, but is historically specific. Second, subjects became dependent on external authorities for self-knowledge. They could not simply know themselves directly, but needed expert interpretation. Doctors explained symptoms, therapists diagnosed issues, educators assessed development. Authority determined what confession revealed. Third, confession became technique for producing normalized subjects. By confessing deviations from norms, individuals exposed themselves to correction. Therapy aimed to normalize psychological functioning. Education aimed to normalize development. Medicine aimed to normalize bodies. Confession enabled identifying and correcting abnormality. Fourth, confession appeared voluntary even when mandatory. Unlike medieval confession explicitly required by church, modern confession often seems freely chosen. People seek therapy, share on social media, volunteer information. But Foucault argued this apparent freedom obscures how thoroughly we are trained to confess and how many contexts require it. Fifth, confession multiplied rather than diminished. One might expect that as societies became more secular, confessional practices would decline. Instead, they proliferated across institutions and media. Modernity intensified the confessional imperative even as it secularized it. The confessional apparatus connects to broader themes in Foucault's work. It exemplifies how modern power operates through requiring subjects to produce truth about themselves. Unlike torture, which extracts truth through violence, confession appears as voluntary speech. The subject becomes complicit in their own governance by speaking truth that authorities use to normalize them. Confession also shows how power produces subjects rather than simply repressing them. Through learning to confess, individuals develop specific modes of selfhood, selves with hidden depths, selves requiring external interpretation, selves constituted by speaking interior truth. Confession does not reveal pre-existing selves but produces particular kinds of subjects. Moreover, confession demonstrates power-knowledge relations. Each confession produces knowledge for authorities while subjecting speakers to power. Medical confession produces knowledge about bodies while authorizing medical intervention. Therapeutic confession produces psychological knowledge while normalizing mental functioning. Confession is simultaneously knowledge production and power exercise. Contemporary digital platforms intensify confessional practices. Social media encourages sharing thoughts, locations, activities, relationships. Dating apps require confessing preferences and histories. Fitness trackers monitor bodily data. Smart devices record domestic behaviors. Algorithms request ratings and reviews. Data mining extracts information from digital traces. This differs from traditional confession in some ways. It is dispersed rather than centralized, continuous rather than periodic, automated rather than personal, but it shares the basic structure. Subjects are required to produce information about themselves that is collected, interpreted, and used to govern them. The confession becomes datafied but remains confessional. Understanding the confession apparatus has practical implications. It suggests skepticism toward demands for disclosure and transparency. It questions whether speaking our truth is always liberating. It prompts examining who benefits when we confess and what happens with confessed information. But it does not mean embracing total silence. Foucault was not advocating refusing all self-disclosure. His point was that confession is neither simply repressive nor simply liberating. Its effects depend on the power relations within which it operates. The challenge is developing different relationships to truth-telling that resist confessional subjection while enabling communication and connection. This might involve refusing to treat interior experience as containing essential truth requiring speech, declining to submit self-understanding to expert authority, sharing experiences in contexts not organized by power asymmetry, experimenting with forms of disclosure that do not produce normalized subjects. The goal is not ending all self-expression but transforming how we relate to speaking truth about ourselves. Biopower and sexuality governing life itself. In the final chapter of The History of Sexuality Volume 1, Foucault introduced a concept that would become central to contemporary political theory, biopower. This form of power operated at the level of populations rather than individuals, targeting biological processes rather than legal subjects. Sexuality, Foucault argued, was the hinge connecting the two levels where modern power intervened, the individual body and the collective population. Traditional sovereign power, as Foucault had described it, operated through the right to take life or let live. The sovereign could kill subjects who violated laws or threatened authority. This right grounded political order. But this power was essentially negative and discontinuous. It intervened through dramatic acts of violence, but left most of life alone. Beginning in the 17th century, a new form of power emerged that operated according to opposite logic, making live and letting die. Instead of threatening death, this power fostered life. Instead of intervening dramatically and occasionally, it operated continuously and mundanely. Instead of targeting juridical subjects, it targeted biological populations. This biopower, as Foucault termed it, organized itself around two poles. The first was anatomopolitics of the human body, which he had analyzed extensively in Discipline and Punish. This involved disciplining individual bodies, training them to be useful and docile through techniques of surveillance, normalization, and examination. The individual body was made into a machine to be optimized. The second pole was biopolitics of the population. This emerged in the 18th century as states began treating populations as biological and demographic phenomena requiring management. Birth rates, death rates, longevity, fertility, health, disease, migration, these became objects of knowledge and targets of intervention. Population was something that could be measured statistically, analyzed scientifically, and regulated through policy. Demography developed to measure population phenomena. Statistics was literally statistics, knowledge necessary for governing. Censuses counted populations and classified them by various categories. Epidemiology tracked disease patterns. Public health emerged as governmental concern. All this produced knowledge about populations as biological masses requiring management. This management aimed to optimize life itself. Public health initiatives sought to reduce mortality and increase longevity. Vaccination campaigns prevented epidemic disease. Sanitation projects improved hygiene. Medical care extended to populations previously left to die. Housing reform addressed urban crowding. Nutritional science optimized diets. The goal was fostering healthy, productive populations. But biopower did not simply care for all life equally. It divided populations into groups deserving different treatment. Some groups were fostered and cultivated. Others were let die, left outside care systems, or actively eliminated. Biopower introduced a fundamental division within populations. Those whose life should be fostered, and those whose death was acceptable or even desirable. This required a way of dividing populations biologically. Racism, Foucault argued, became central to biopower precisely because it provided biological justification for letting some die while making others live. Under sovereign power, enemies were defined politically. Under biopower, threats were defined biologically. Inferior races, degenerate types, dangerous classes, these biological categories justified differential treatment. This was modern state racism, different from ethnic hatred that had always existed. It was biologized and scientized. It claimed to identify biological threats to population health and quality. It justified eliminating or neglecting certain groups not from hatred but from apparent biological necessity. Eugenics exemplified this logic. Improving population quality required preventing reproduction of the unfit. Nazi genocide represented the extreme case. The Holocaust was not just old-fashioned ethnic persecution. It mobilized biopower to its limit. Jews, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals were constructed as biological threats to Aryan population health. Their elimination was presented as biological necessity, protecting the life of the Germanic race. Genocide became biopower's ultimate expression. But Foucault insisted that less extreme forms of biopower pervaded modern states. Colonial racism justified letting colonized populations die from disease, famine, and exploitation. American eugenics forcibly sterilized those deemed genetically inferior. Welfare states divided populations into deserving and undeserving. Immigration policy determined which lives could enter national territory. Each involved biopower deciding which populations to foster and which to let die. Sexuality became crucial to biopower because it connected individual bodies to population processes. Sexual behavior affected both individual health and demographic outcomes. Through sexuality, biopower could simultaneously discipline individual bodies and regulate populations. This was why sexuality became so intensely politicized in modernity. At the individual level, sexuality was disciplined through all the techniques Foucault had analyzed: medical examination, psychiatric classification, pedagogical surveillance, confessional interrogation. These trained individuals to relate to their sexuality in specific ways. They produced sexual subjects who internalized norms and self-regulated their desires and behaviors. At the population level, sexuality was managed through policies affecting reproduction and health. Marriage laws regulated unions and legitimacy. Pronatalist policies encouraged births in some groups, discouraged them in others. Birth control was promoted or prohibited depending on population goals. Sex education aimed to shape reproductive behavior. Public health campaigns addressed sexually transmitted diseases. The deployment of sexuality thus served biopower by providing mechanisms for both individual discipline and population management. It made sexuality central to identity, requiring constant self-examination and external regulation. It positioned experts as authorities who could interpret sexual truth and prescribe proper behavior. It linked personal sexual conduct to collective population outcomes. Foucault identified 4 strategic unities through which biopower operated on sexuality. The historization of women's bodies made female sexuality a medical concern requiring constant intervention. The pedagogization of children's sex made childhood sexuality an object of surveillance and regulation. The socialization of procreative behavior subjected reproduction to social norms and policies. The psychiatrization of perverse pleasure classified and pathologized non-reproductive sexualities. Each unity connected individual bodies to population management. Regulating women's reproduction affected birth rates. Managing childhood sexuality shaped developmental norms. Socializing procreation influenced demographic composition. Controlling perversion protected population health. Sexuality was the point where disciplinary and biopolitical power intersected and reinforced each other. This analysis explains several historical phenomena. The Victorian obsession with sexuality was not repression, but intense biopower mobilization. Sexuality had to be known, measured, and managed because it affected both individual health and population vigor. The proliferation of sexual discourse served biopower's need for knowledge to govern life effectively. The emergence of racial science in the 19th century connected to biopower's need to divide populations biologically. Sexuality was racialized. Different races supposedly had different sexual characteristics affecting reproductive capacity and population quality. This justified differential treatment and, in extreme cases, elimination. The medicalization of sexuality served biopower by producing expert knowledge justifying intervention. Doctors claimed authority over sexual health. Psychiatrists claimed authority over sexual normality. Public health officials claimed authority over sexual behavior affecting populations. Medical expertise became essential to biopower's operation. 20th century developments confirmed biopower's centrality. Nazi genocide represented biopower's murderous extreme, but less violent forms pervaded welfare states, colonial administrations, and international development programs. population control in developing countries, immigration restrictions, differential healthcare access, eugenic sterilization, all exemplified biopower determining which populations lived and which died. Contemporary biomedicine intensifies biopower. Reproductive technologies enable selecting which embryos implant and develop. Genetic testing identifies risks requiring intervention. Pharmaceutical intervention regulates moods, attention, sexual function. Public health increasingly focuses on lifestyle management. Quantified self-movements track biological data to optimize health. Life itself becomes object of technological intervention and optimization. Biopolitics explains contemporary issues traditional political theory struggles with. Why do states invest heavily in population health while letting certain groups die from neglect? Because biopower always involves dividing populations into those worth fostering and those expendable. Why is reproduction increasingly subject to technological management? Because biopower requires optimizing population quality and composition. Why has racism persisted despite formal equality? Because modern racism is biologized, functioning to divide populations for biopower purposes. Why is sexuality so thoroughly politicized despite liberalization? Because sexuality connects individual bodies to population processes that biopower must manage. Understanding biopower is essential for contemporary political struggles. Health justice requires recognizing that healthcare distribution reflects biopower's divisions between populations worth saving and those left to die. Reproductive rights involve resisting biopower's control over fertility and reproduction. Immigration justice requires challenging biopower's determination of which lives can cross borders. Environmental politics increasingly involves biopower. Climate change threatens population survival. Environmental justice concerns which populations suffer pollution and which enjoy clean environments. Planetary management seeks to regulate human populations as biological phenomenon affecting Earth systems. These are biopower questions at global scale. Foucault's concept remains controversial. Some argue it overstates state power and understates resistance. Others claim it cannot explain neoliberalism's dismantling of welfare state biopolitics. Still others find it too focused on European history to explain colonial and post-colonial biopower. But the concept continues generating productive research on how modern power governs life itself. The key insight is that modern power operates increasingly through fostering life rather than threatening death. This makes it seem benevolent, even as it involves profound violence against those populations let die. Biopower claims to serve life itself, making it difficult to oppose. But recognizing its operations reveals that decisions about which lives matter and which are expendable are political, not natural or necessary. This opens possibilities for contesting biopower's divisions and demanding justice for all forms of life. Care of the Self, Ancient Greek Ethics. In the final years before his death, Foucault made a surprising turn. After spending decades analyzing modern power and its normalizing effects, he began studying ancient Greek and Roman ethics. This was not an escape from political concerns, but a way of imagining different possibilities for freedom and self-creation. The ancient practices of caring for the self offered an alternative to modern confessional subjectivity. Foucault published the second and third volumes of The History of Sexuality in 1984, just months before his death. These books, The Use of Pleasure and The Care of the Self, departed radically from the first volume. Instead of analyzing modern sexuality, they examined how ancient Greeks and Romans related to sexual pleasure and ethical conduct. The shift puzzled many readers who had been waiting 8 years for the promised analysis of modern sexuality. But Foucault explained that his project had required rethinking. He had initially planned to trace how modern sexuality emerged as an object of knowledge and control, but researching this history revealed that ancient approaches to sexual ethics were fundamentally different from modern ones. Understanding this difference opened possibilities for thinking about ethics and freedom in new ways. Ancient Greek ethics, particularly in the classical period of the 4th and 5th centuries BCE, did not organize itself around universal moral codes or divine commandments. It focused instead on how free men should conduct themselves to live honorably and beautifully. Ethics was an aesthetic practice of self-fashioning rather than obedience to law. The central concept was epimeleia hautu, usually translated as care of the self. This meant attending to oneself, cultivating oneself, working on oneself to achieve excellence. It was not selfish individualism, but a demanding practice requiring constant effort. Caring for the self meant subjecting oneself to exercises, tests, and disciplines chosen to develop specific virtues and capacities. Socrates embodied this practice. He spent his days engaging citizens in philosophical dialogue, questioning their beliefs, urging them to examine their lives. His famous statement that the unexamined life is not worth living expressed the imperative to care for the self through constant self-scrutiny and improvement. Philosophy was not abstract theory, but a way of life centered on self-care. This care involved several practices. First, ascesis, meaning exercise or training. Like athletes training bodies, individuals trained souls through repeated practices. These included philosophical dialogue, memorization of maxims, meditation on death, examination of daily actions, and various techniques for developing self-control. Second, dietetics, meaning the management of pleasure. Greeks did not prohibit most pleasures, but emphasized using them appropriately. The question was not whether to enjoy food, wine, or sex, but how much, when, with whom, in what manner. Excess in any direction was problematic. The goal was temperance, using pleasures without being dominated by them. Third, economics in the original sense of household management. Free men had to manage their households well, overseeing slaves, administering property, relating properly to wives. This required self-mastery. A man who could not control himself could not effectively govern others. Fourth, erotics, meaning the ethical problems posed by love and desire. Greek ethics was particularly concerned with relationships between older men and adolescent boys, which were socially accepted but ethically complex. The concern was whether desire would lead to loss of self-control or could be conducted in ways that maintained honor and promoted virtue. In all these domains, the fundamental issue was enkrateia, self-mastery, or self-control. The free man must master himself before aspiring to participate in political life or philosophical inquiry. Someone ruled by appetites was slavish regardless of legal status. Self-mastery was the condition for legitimate authority over others. Sexual ethics exemplified this approach. Ancient Greeks did not categorize sexual acts as absolutely prohibited or permitted. They did not divide people into heterosexual and homosexual identities. They did not make sexuality central to selfhood. Instead, they evaluated sexual conduct according to whether it manifested self-mastery and maintained proper social relations. What mattered was taking the active or passive role, not the gender of one's partner. Adult free men should be active, penetrating rather than penetrated. Being passive sexually implied lack of self-control, allowing oneself to be used by others. This was shameful for free men, though acceptable for women, boys, and slaves who occupied subordinate social positions. Excess of any kind indicated lack of self-mastery. Too much sex, even with appropriate partners, suggested being dominated by appetite. The ideal was measured use of pleasure, demonstrating that reason controlled desire. Moderation was key, not because pleasure was evil, but because excess revealed insufficient self-government. These ethical concerns were not universally binding. They applied primarily to free adult men, the minority who participated in political life. Women, slaves, and foreigners were subject to different expectations and often excluded from ethical cultivation. Greek ethics was fundamentally aristocratic, concerned with how privileged men should conduct themselves. But within this limited scope, ethics operated very differently from Christian morality that would later dominate Western culture. There was no divine law to obey, no universal moral code, no institutional authority to enforce proper behavior. Ethics was self-chosen work on oneself to achieve an aesthetic ideal of existence. Christianity transformed this fundamentally. Christian morality introduced several innovations. First, it universalized ethics. Moral rules applied equally to all souls regardless of social status. Second, it codified ethics. Specific acts were prohibited absolutely, not evaluated contextually. Third, it institutionalized ethics. The Church claimed authority to determine proper conduct. Fourth, Christianity made desire itself problematic. Greeks worried about excess but accepted desire as natural. Christianity made desire sinful, requiring constant examination and control. Fifth, Christianity linked ethics to salvation. Proper conduct was necessary for eternal life, raising the stakes infinitely. Sixth, Christianity required obedience to external authority rather than self-chosen cultivation. Most importantly, Christianity introduced confession as the primary ethical technique. Instead of working on oneself through chosen exercises, individuals had to examine themselves constantly for sin and confess transgressions to authorities who judged and imposed penance. The self became something to be deciphered rather than crafted, interpreted rather than cultivated. Foucault contrasted two modes of ethics, morality as obedience to code versus ethics as self-fashioning. Code-oriented morality emphasizes rules to follow and authorities to obey. Self-fashioning ethics emphasizes practices for cultivating oneself according to chosen ideals. Christianity exemplified the first, ancient ethics the second. Modern morality inherited Christian code orientation even when secularized. Kantian ethics posited universal moral laws. Utilitarianism calculated obligations through rational principles. Both presumed ethics meant determining rules to obey. The self was judged by conformity to standards rather than quality of self-cultivation. But ancient ethics suggested an alternative. What if ethics was not primarily about obeying rules but creating oneself as a work of art? What if the goal was not conforming to norms but fashioning an original existence? What if morality was aesthetic practice rather than juridical judgment? This appealed to Foucault because it offered escape from modern normalization. If ethics is about obeying codes, then institutional authorities claim the right to judge conformity and correct deviation. Everyone must fit the same mold. But if ethics is self-fashioning, then diversity becomes possible. Different individuals create different modes of existence according to different aesthetic ideals. Foucault was not proposing that moderns simply adopt ancient Greek ethics. That was impossible and undesirable. Ancient ethics was embedded in a hierarchical society based on slavery. Its restriction to free men was unacceptable. Its specific practices reflected cultural contexts that no longer exist. But ancient ethics demonstrated that other ways of relating to morality and selfhood were possible. It proved that ethics need not center on confession, normalization, and obedience to code. It showed that self-cultivation through chosen practices was a viable alternative. This opened imaginative space for creating new ethical practices suited to contemporary conditions. Foucault suggested that contemporary gay culture was developing something analogous to ancient ethics. Gay men, lacking established social scripts for their relationships and lives, had to invent new ways of existing. They created new forms of relationship, community, pleasure, and identity. This was not just political resistance, but ethical experimentation, fashioning new modes of existence. This connected to Foucault's earlier work on power and resistance. If modern power operates through normalization, imposing identities, and controlling life according to administrative rationality, then resistance requires creating new possibilities for existence. This is not just claiming rights or overthrowing power, but inventing new forms of life that exceed what power makes possible. The care of the self, understood as aesthetic practice of self-creation, offered a model for this invention. It required work, constant effort, chosen disciplines, risk-taking experiments. It required community, others with whom to develop practices and share experiences. It required courage, willingness to live differently despite social pressure to conform. Contemporary self-care culture often trivializes this ancient concept. Commercial wellness industries sell self-care as consumption, spa treatments, meditation apps, self-help books. But Foucault's care of the self was demanding ethical practice, not consumer indulgence. It meant subjecting oneself to difficult exercises, questioning one's assumptions, transforming one's relationship to pleasure and desire. The care of the self also differed from modern therapy culture. Therapy aims to normalize psychological functioning, adapting individuals to social expectations. Ancient self-care aimed to exceed ordinary existence, achieving excellence that distinguished one from the crowd. Therapy seeks adjustment. Self-care seeks transformation. Understanding ancient ethics helps us imagine alternatives to both traditional morality and modern psychology. Instead of obedience to rules or adaptation to norms, ethics could mean creating oneself according to self-chosen principles. Instead of discovering one's true identity or conforming to imposed categories, one could fashion an existence as a work of art. This requires what Foucault called technologies of the self, techniques through which individuals act on themselves to transform themselves. Ancient examples included philosophical dialogue, meditation, writing, dietary regulation, and sexual temperance. Modern equivalents might include different practices suited to contemporary conditions, but sharing the goal of self-transformation through chosen disciplines. The ancient emphasis on self-mastery also offers resources for thinking about freedom. Neoliberalism claims to provide freedom through market choice and deregulation, but this produces subjects enslaved to consumption, debt, and economic imperatives. Ancient self-mastery suggests that freedom requires governing oneself rather than being governed by appetite, opinion, or economic necessity. This is not the libertarian fantasy of isolated individuals free from all constraint. Ancient self-care was social, practiced within communities, and oriented toward participation in collective life. Mastering oneself was necessary for legitimate participation in politics. Contemporary versions would similarly connect self-cultivation to collective flourishing rather than selfish individualism. Foucault's turn to ancient ethics has been criticized. Some argue it romanticizes a deeply hierarchical and exclusionary culture. Others claim it retreats from political engagement into personal cultivation. Still others find it incompatible with his earlier emphasis on power's inescapability. But Foucault insisted this was continuous with his earlier work. Analyzing how modern power normalizes subjects made urgent the task of creating new possibilities for existence. Ancient ethics provided historical proof that radically different modes of selfhood were possible. This knowledge could inspire contemporary experiments in living otherwise than power dictates. The care of the self remains Foucault's most open-ended concept. He did not prescribe specific practices or dictate what self-fashioning should look like. He offered historical examples and theoretical frameworks, but left the practical work to others. This openness is fitting. Ethics as aesthetic self-creation cannot be standardized or imposed. Each individual and community must invent their own practices for creating lives worth living. Parrhesia, the courage to speak dangerous truths. In his final lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault explored a concept from ancient philosophy that fascinated him: parrhesia. This Greek term is usually translated as frank speech, free speech, or truth-telling, but its meaning was more specific and ethically charged than these translations suggest. Parrhesia meant speaking truth to power at personal risk, requiring courage and carrying ethical weight. The concept emerged in ancient Greek democracy. In the Athenian assembly, citizens had isagoria, the equal right to speak. But not everyone exercised parrhesia. This required not just speaking, but speaking truth frankly, holding nothing back, even when dangerous. The parrhesiastes, the one who practices parrhesia, risked punishment, exile, or death by speaking truth that challenged power. Several features distinguished parrhesia from other forms of speech. First, the speaker must believe what they say is true. Flattery or rhetoric designed to please audiences is not parrhesia. The speaker states their genuine conviction regardless of whether others want to hear it. Second, there must be risk. Speaking truth when it costs nothing is not parrhesia. The danger could be physical, execution, exile, imprisonment, or social, loss of friendship, reputation, position. What matters is that the speaker accepts personal danger to speak truth. Third, it is a duty. The parrhesiastes speaks not from desire for attention, but from ethical obligation. When they see falsehood, injustice, or danger, remaining silent would be shameful. They speak because truth must be told whatever the consequences. Fourth, it requires courage. This was not just physical bravery, but ethical courage. The willingness to put truth above personal safety, reputation, or gain. The parrhesiastes must overcome fear, social pressure, and temptation to remain silent. Fifth, it is directed upward. Parrhesia characteristically involves speaking truth to those with more power, citizens challenging rulers, students challenging teachers, subordinates challenging superiors. Speaking harsh truths to those powerless to retaliate is not parrhesia, but abuse. Greek literature provided many examples. In Euripides' plays, characters practice parrhesia by speaking harsh truths to kings, risking execution. In Plato's dialogues, Socrates embodies parrhesia by questioning Athenian citizens about their ignorance despite the danger this brings. His execution for impiety and corrupting youth was the ultimate price of parrhesia. The concept evolved in the Hellenistic period. Cynics practiced parrhesia publicly, challenging social conventions and powerful individuals through provocative speech and action. Diogenes confronted Alexander the Great, asking him to move out of his sunlight. This displayed parrhesia, speaking to power without deference, asserting truth regardless of status differences. Philosophical schools emphasized parrhesia in teacher-student relationships. The philosopher had a duty to speak frankly to students about their faults, errors, and need for improvement. Students needed courage to hear harsh criticism and willingness to be transformed by truth. Philosophical parrhesia aimed at ethical transformation through truthful speech. Parrhesia also appeared in personal relationships. Friends owed each other frank criticism. True friendship involved speaking truth even when painful, not flattering or remaining silent about faults. This distinguished genuine friendship from relationships based on utility or pleasure. As Greek democracy gave way to Roman Empire, parrhesia transformed. Under imperial rule, speaking truth to the emperor became extremely dangerous. But the concept persisted, especially in Stoicism. The Stoic advisor to the emperor practiced parrhesia by offering frank counsel despite risk. The emperor who listened demonstrated virtue by accepting truthful criticism. Christianity adapted parrhesia in new ways. Early Christians claimed parrhesia before God and worldly powers. Martyrs demonstrated parrhesia by refusing to deny faith despite torture and execution. Monastic confessors practiced parrhesia by revealing their thoughts completely to spiritual directors. But Christian parrhesia became increasingly linked to obedience and submission rather than courage in challenging power. Foucault was interested in parrhesia because it represented an alternative to confessional truth-telling. Both involved speaking truth about oneself or the world, but confession required submitting to authority who interpreted one's speech and imposed judgment. Parrhesia involved challenging authority by speaking truth it did not want to hear. In confession, the speaker occupies a subordinate position, revealing secrets to a superior who judges and prescribes. In parrhesia, the speaker challenges a superior, risking punishment to speak necessary truth. Confession reinforces power relations. Parrhesia disrupts them. Moreover, confession aims to normalize the subject, bringing them into conformity with established norms. Parrhesia aims to transform both speaker and listener through truth-telling. The parrhesiastes does not confess deviation from norms, but challenges the norms themselves as false or unjust. Foucault saw parrhesia as an ethical practice relevant to contemporary political struggles. Modern societies claim to value free speech, but often punish those who speak uncomfortable truths. Whistleblowers exposing government wrongdoing face prosecution. Activists challenging injustice face surveillance and repression. Intellectuals criticizing power face marginalization. True free speech, parrhesia properly understood, requires more than legal protection. It requires ethical courage to speak truth despite personal cost. It requires community willing to hear difficult truths. It requires recognizing truth-telling as ethical duty, even when dangerous. Foucault distinguished parrhesia from several other speech acts. It is not demonstration, which proves truth through logical argument. Demonstration aims at rational conviction. Parrhesia aims at ethical transformation through courageous truth-telling. It is not teaching, which transmits established knowledge. Teaching involves epistemic authority, the teacher knowing what the student does not. Parrhesia involves ethical authority, the speaker having courage to state what others fear to say. It is not prophecy, which reveals hidden futures or divine messages. Prophecy speaks truth from supernatural authority. Parrhesia speaks truth from personal conviction and ethical commitment. It is not technical expertise, which provides specialized knowledge. Experts speak from professional authority. Parrhesia requires no special knowledge, only courage to state what one believes true. What distinguishes parrhesia is the combination of truth, risk, duty, and courage. These elements transform simple speech into ethical practice. The parrhesiastes stakes themselves on their words, accepting consequences because truth must be told. This had implications for intellectuals and political movements. Foucault had long been skeptical of intellectuals who claimed universal authority to speak for others. He distinguished universal intellectuals, who claimed to represent truth and justice for all, from specific intellectuals who use specific expertise to address particular problems. Parrhesia offered another model, the intellectual as truth-teller who challenges power through courageous speech. This required no claim to universal knowledge or representative authority. It required only willingness to speak truth at personal cost. Political movements also needed parrhesia. Too often, radical politics reproduced the structures it opposed. Hierarchical organization, leadership claiming authority, members expected to conform. Parrhesia suggested an alternative. Movements where members felt obligated to speak truth to each other and to power, where critique was welcomed rather than punished, where courage in challenging authority was valued. Foucault practiced parrhesia throughout his career. He challenged psychiatric power by exposing how it normalized rather than cured. He challenged the prison system by revealing its systematic failure. He challenged comfortable leftist assumptions about liberation and progress. He criticized both capitalist and socialist states. This earned him many enemies but exemplified commitment to truth-telling over safety or popularity. His activism also embodied parrhesia. He spoke publicly against torture, political repression, and unjust imprisonment. He used his growing fame to amplify voices of prisoners, immigrants, and other marginalized groups. He testified in legal proceedings despite professional risk. He confronted authorities directly through protests and interventions. But Foucault insisted that parrhesia was not heroic individualism. It required community and preparation. The ancient philosophers prepared for parrhesia through ascesis, training themselves to have courage when needed. They surrounded themselves with friends who would speak truth to them. They cultivated indifference to comfort and reputation, so these could not be used to silence them. Contemporary parrhesia requires similar preparation and community. Whistleblowers need organizations that will support them. Activists need movements that value courage over obedience. Intellectuals need communities that encourage critical thought over conformity. Without these supports, individual truth-telling becomes impossible or ineffective. Digital media creates new possibilities and problems for Parisia. Social media enables speaking to large audiences without institutional gatekeepers. Leaks and whistleblowing can expose hidden truths to global publics. Anonymous speech reduces personal risk. But digital Parisia faces distinctive challenges. Anonymity can enable truth-telling but may undermine ethical authority of the speaker. Speaking to audiences that already agree is not Parisia but confirmation. Viral speech can create pile-ons that punish rather than transform. The question remains how to practice courageous truth-telling in digital contexts. Foucault's analysis of Parisia was incomplete at his death. The lectures were published posthumously, showing work in progress. But the concept captured his final thinking about ethics and politics. After decades analyzing power's operations, he turned to practices of freedom, how individuals and communities could resist power through courageous ethical action. Parisia represents one such practice. It cannot eliminate power or create perfect freedom, but it enables specific acts of resistance by specific individuals willing to risk themselves for truth. It models an ethical stance of permanent critique rather than final liberation. This connects to Foucault's earlier work while extending it. Power relations are inescapable, but they are also unstable. They produce resistance even as they constrain. Parisia is one form this resistance takes. Speaking truth that disrupts power, accepting personal cost, aiming to transform relationships and institutions through courageous truth-telling. The concept remains relevant as contemporary societies face crises of truth. When institutions systematically deceive, when propaganda overwhelms discourse, when speaking uncomfortable facts becomes dangerous, Parisia becomes urgent ethical practice. It requires not just asserting facts, but accepting responsibility and risk for truth-telling. Foucault offered no guarantee that Parisia succeeds. The Parisiastes may be ignored, punished, or killed. But the practice itself affirms that truth matters, that courage is possible, that individuals are not simply passive before power. This affirmation, regardless of outcome, makes Parisia essential to any politics of freedom. The art of not being governed like that, living Foucault today. Foucault died before he could fully articulate his late ethics, but his final works and interviews sketched a vision. Life as a work of art, created through conscious practices of self-fashioning rather than submission to imposed norms. This was not a retreat from politics, but a radicalization of resistance. If modern power operates through normalization, freedom requires creating new modes of existence that exceed what power makes possible. One of Foucault's most quoted statements came from a 1978 essay titled "What is Critique?" He defined critique as the art of not being governed, or better, the art of not being governed like that, and at that cost. This formulation captured his mature political stance. He did not pursue utopian fantasy of eliminating governance entirely. Humans will always govern themselves and each other through various institutions and practices. The question is how and at what price. Critique means refusing particular forms of governance that are unnecessary, harmful, or unjust. It means questioning authorities who claim natural or inevitable right to govern. It means examining costs of governance and refusing to pay when costs exceed benefits. This is permanent critique, ongoing vigilance, continual resistance to specific power relations. This stance rejected both revolutionary utopianism and conservative acceptance. Revolutionary thought promised total transformation, abolishing power to create perfect freedom. But Foucault's analysis showed power is relational and pervasive, not something concentrated in a state that can be overthrown. Eliminating one form of power does not end power but transforms how it operates. Conservative acceptance of existing arrangements as natural or necessary was equally untenable. Foucault's historical work demonstrated that current institutions emerged contingently and could be otherwise. What appears natural is historically constructed. What seems necessary serves particular interests. Critique reveals this contingency and challenges claims of necessity. The alternative was permanent critique combined with practical experimentation. Question existing arrangements. Analyze how they emerged and whom they serve. Refuse those that are intolerable. Create alternatives through concrete practice. Transform oneself and one's relations with others. This required perpetual work, not a final revolutionary moment. This ethical political stance had several components. First, analysis. Understanding how power operates in specific domains, tracing genealogies of current institutions and practices, identifying mechanisms through which normalization occurs. This was intellectual work requiring historical knowledge, theoretical sophistication, and empirical investigation. Second, refusal. saying no to specific instances of power that are unacceptable. This might mean refusing to conform to imposed identities, declining to submit to illegitimate authority, or withdrawing participation from unjust institutions. Refusal alone does not transform structures, but creates space for alternatives. Third, experimentation, creating new practices, relationships, institutions, and modes of existence. This was positive work of invention, not just negative resistance. It required imagination, courage, and practical effort. It meant trying things without knowing if they would succeed. Fourth, community. These practices could not be purely individual. Creating new modes of existence required collective experimentation, mutual support, and institutional alternatives. Communities provided contexts where different possibilities could be explored and sustained. Foucault identified several contemporary movements that exemplified this approach. Prison abolition movements did not simply demand closing prisons. They analyzed the entire carceral system, refused its normalizing logic, and created alternatives like restorative justice. They combined critique with practical experimentation. Gay liberation movements challenged psychiatric power, refused heteronormative identities, and created new forms of relationship and community. They did not just seek legal equality, but invented new modes of existence. They made sexuality a site of ethical experimentation rather than medical or moral judgment. Feminist movements questioned power relations in family, workplace, and politics. They refused gender norms claiming to be natural. They created women's spaces, alternative institutions, and transformed practices. They combined structural analysis with practical reconstruction of daily life. Anti-colonial movements challenged imperial power, refused imposed identities and institutions, and created new national and cultural forms. They showed that colonial arrangements were neither natural nor necessary. They invented practices combining indigenous traditions with modern institutions in original ways. These movements shared key features. They analyzed specific power relations rather than pursuing abstract revolution. They refused particular forms of domination while recognizing power's persistence. They created practical alternatives rather than just articulating demands. They transformed both structures and subjectivities. Foucault emphasized that creating oneself as a work of art was a collective process, not solitary aesthetic contemplation. It required others. Communities of experimentation, critical friends who practice parrhesia, social movements that sustain alternative practices. Ethical self-fashioning was political practice embedded in relationships and institutions. Technologies of the self provided concrete means for this work. These were techniques through which individuals acted on themselves to achieve transformation. Ancient examples included philosophical dialogue, meditation, dietary regulation, and written self-examination. Modern equivalents might be different, but served similar functions, subjecting oneself to disciplines that enable becoming different than one is. Foucault suggested several contemporary practices. Writing could be technology of the self, not just recording thoughts, but transforming oneself through the act of writing. Reading could similarly transform if approached as practice of self-modification rather than passive consumption. Dialogue with others could be practice of mutual transformation if conducted with honesty and openness to change. Physical practices like diet, exercise, or sexual experimentation could be technologies of the self if undertaken consciously to achieve transformation. The point was not specific content, but the relationship to practice, choosing disciplines to work on oneself rather than conforming to imposed norms. This raised questions about the relationship between Foucault's late ethics and his earlier analysis of power. Critics argued he contradicted himself. How could he now advocate self-creation after spending decades showing how power constitutes subjects? If power is inescapable, how is freedom possible? Foucault responded that power and freedom were not opposites but conditions of each other. Power relations exist only between free subjects who could act otherwise. Where there is no freedom, there is only physical violence, not power. Similarly, freedom exists only within power relations as the refusal or transformation of specific constraints. This meant freedom was not liberation from all constraint, but capacity to resist specific forms of domination. It was not discovering authentic self beneath social construction, but creating self through practices that exceeded what power made possible. Freedom was practical accomplishment, not pre-existing essence. Resistance, then, was not revolutionary rupture, but constant work. Every power relation produced resistance even while constraining. The challenge was to develop effective strategies of resistance suited to specific contexts. This required analyzing how power operated locally, identifying vulnerabilities, and experimenting with alternatives. Foucault's own political involvements embodied this approach. He engaged specific struggles, prison reform, immigration rights, mental health, gay rights, opposition to nuclear weapons. He did not propose comprehensive political programs, but intervened where analysis suggested resistance was possible and necessary. He practiced what he called specific intellectual work, using expertise to address particular problems rather than claiming universal authority. Intellectuals should not tell others what to do, but provide tools for understanding power and experimenting with resistance. They should speak from experience and knowledge while recognizing limits of that knowledge. This had implications for how we read Foucault today. He did not offer a political program to implement or a theory to apply mechanically. He provided analytical tools and ethical orientations. How these are used depends on specific contexts and struggles. Reading Foucault means using his concepts to analyze power in our situations and develop appropriate resistances. Contemporary applications of Foucault's approach address multiple domains. Digital surveillance requires understanding how power operates through data collection and algorithmic governance. Resistance involves refusing surveillance where possible, creating encrypted alternatives, demanding transparency and accountability. Neoliberal governance requires analyzing how market rationality colonizes all domains. Resistance involves creating non-commodified spaces, refusing to treat everything as resource for optimization, valuing forms of life outside market logic. Mass incarceration requires genealogical analysis of carceral expansion and racist implementation. Resistance involves abolition work, divesting from prisons, creating community-based alternatives, transforming relationships to harm and accountability. Climate crisis requires analyzing how fossil capitalism has governed populations and environments. Resistance involves creating sustainable practices, transforming relationships to land and resources, building communities organized around ecological rather than extractive principles. Each domain requires specific analysis and experimentation, but Foucault's general approach remains relevant. Understand how power operates, refuse intolerable aspects, create alternatives through practice, transform both structures and selves. The art of not being governed like that, finally, means refusing to accept present arrangements as necessary or natural. It means questioning authorities who claim inevitable right to govern. It means recognizing that things could be otherwise because they became what they are through contingent history. But it also means positive work of creation, inventing new modes of existence, developing alternative institutions, fashioning selves according to chosen principles rather than imposed norms. This requires courage to experiment, patience to sustain efforts over time, and community to support collective transformation. Foucault left this work incomplete. His death at 57 cut short the ethical project he had just begun. We cannot know what he would have written about technologies of the self, practices of freedom, or ethics as aesthetics of existence. But his final works pointed in a direction, toward an ethics of self-fashioning that was simultaneously political practice of resistance. Living Foucault today means continuing this project. It means analyzing how contemporary power normalizes subjects and governs populations. It means refusing specific instances of domination while recognizing power's persistence. It means experimenting with new practices, relationships, and institutions. It means transforming ourselves as we work to transform the world. This offers no guarantee of success and no promise of final liberation. It is work without end, struggle without ultimate victory. But it affirms that resistance is possible, that freedom can be practiced, that we are not simply determined by power but can create ourselves and our world differently. This affirmation, sober yet hopeful, remains Foucault's most valuable legacy for contemporary thought and practice.